Now, tonight I would like to address several questions which have been discussed and thought about and meditated on by men and women throughout the ages. They're very fundamental metaphysical and existential questions which also have scientific aspects. The questions are: what is the nature of mind? What is matter made of? What is the relation between mind and matter? What is consciousness? What is life? These are sort of, that should do it for the evening. And actually I've cheated a little because we'll talk about consciousness tomorrow. I won't talk much about consciousness tonight, but all the others I will touch on tonight. And I would like to give you an idea of what science can say about these questions now. And the statements that science can make about these questions are quite recent. As far as physics is concerned, they are already 50 years old or a little older. But as far as mind and life and consciousness is concerned, they are really not much older than 10 years. So these are really recent developments, and they are developments that I have not yet really integrated with my whole worldview, so there'll be a lot of interesting questions and discussions, I'm sure, especially tomorrow. Now, the answer to these questions, the answers or the tentative answers, are all part of a new kind of worldview or a new paradigm. And I would like just to say a few words before I go into the actual questions about this change of worldview, which is now often called a paradigm shift. It is a shift of worldview that began in physics at the beginning of this century and has affected many of the other sciences. It is a shift also of values, of attitudes, of beliefs that is now affecting our whole culture. The shift is from a worldview which was formulated essentially in the 17th century, mainly by Descartes and Newton, but by other people also. And I call it usually the Cartesian worldview. It's a mechanistic worldview where the world is seen as, the universe is seen as a collection of separate objects that work together in some kind of a machine. There are rigid laws of cause and effect. An objective description of nature is the ideal. There's a sharp distinction and separation between mind and matter, and all that is part of that classical mechanistic worldview. The new worldview that is now emerging could be called a holistic worldview, or it could be called an organic view or an ecological view. It is a view where the various things and phenomena that we observe are seen as being fundamentally interconnected, interrelated, and interdependent. It is a view where the human mind and human consciousness is an essential part of the observed phenomena and is no longer separated. And this worldview, the shift, is a tremendous shift which we are now undergoing as a society and as a culture. And let me just tell you a few things about how this shift occurred in physics at the beginning of the century, actually mainly in the 1920s. Physicists saw themselves confronted with entirely new phenomena, the phenomena of the atomic realm. For the first time they were able to do experiments involving atoms, and none of the old concepts really fitted that new reality. But the old concepts were the only ones they had, and so they struggled, and they were really challenged and threatened in a sense by the situation. Their very ability to understand nature was severely challenged, and they went through a state of crisis. It was first of all an intellectual crisis, but also an emotional crisis, and you could say even an existential crisis, because of the very basic nature of these concepts. Concepts like space, time, cause and effect, object, and so on. These very basic concepts didn't fit the observed phenomena any longer, and these handful of men and women really struggled with these questions extremely hard, And it's a whole interesting chapter in the history of science, which is still to be written, how they dealt with the situation. Some of them got sick, some of them went on long walks and on long mountain trips alone to sort of, Niels Bohr did that, to wrestle with the questions. Others sought help from psychologists, philosophers, mystics, and so on. There was a whole movement and struggle to find the answers. Well, they did find the answers, and they did overcome the crisis, and were rewarded with very deep insights about the nature of matter and the nature of mind, and that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, about these insights. Now, in recent years, I have studied the implications of the new paradigm that has emerged in physics for the other sciences and for our society as a whole, and I've more and more come to realize that as a society now, we find ourselves in a very similar situation. Now, we all know that we are in a state of crisis. We have an economic crisis, we have an energy crisis, we have an ecological crisis, we have nuclear weapons and that crisis and that threat, and we have a crisis in healthcare, and we have all these various crises which I believe are just facets of one and the same crisis, and this crisis is essentially a crisis of perception. It arises, just as the crisis that physicists went through, from our attempts to apply an outdated worldview to a new situation. The outdated Cartesian worldview, which is valid in a certain context, but has its severe limitations. And that is the worldview that dominates still our medicine, our psychology, our economics, our educational system, our political and social structures, and so on. And it's a worldview that isn't valid any longer, that has outlived its usefulness. And therefore, we are seeing the limitations of this worldview, and the various facets of the crisis can be seen as resulting from these limitations. Now, the book that I'm writing now, that I'm just finishing now, deals with these questions, the limitations of the Cartesian worldview as the major cause or a major cause of the current social and cultural crisis. But tonight I don't want to talk about the social implications, and if any question comes up in the discussion, I'd be happy to answer it. But I would really like to talk about some aspects of the new paradigm, of the new worldview. And I'm going to first talk about the view of matter that has emerged from modern physics, the question, what is matter made of? And then talk about the nature of living organisms, and then go on from there and talk about mind and so on. Now, as far as matter is concerned, the classical worldview that was worked out by Newton in classical physics, in Newtonian mechanics, sees matter as being made of several basic building blocks, an idea that goes back to the Greek atomists, atoms in empty space, and sees these particles or elementary building blocks as working together in some kind of mechanical system. Now, at the beginning of the century, when physics observed atoms and studied them, they found out that atoms are not at all hard and solid basic building blocks. Atoms consist essentially of empty space. There's a tiny nucleus in the center of an atom, and then there are electrons whirling around in a relatively vast space. So they thought then, well, the atoms are not the basic building blocks, but maybe these particles are, the protons and neutrons inside the nucleus and the electrons whirling around. And they talked about elementary particles. But it turned out they were very wrong again. And they found out that these particles cannot really be understood as isolated entities, but can only be understood as interconnections. When you observe or when you analyze the process of observation in atomic physics, you are forced to conclude that subatomic particles are not things, but are interconnections between things. And then you say, well, what are these things that they interconnect? And you study them and you find there are interconnections, again, between other things which turn out to be interconnections, and you never end up with any things at all. In atomic physics, you always end up with interconnections. And that's the basic lesson of atomic physics. The theory, the mathematical theory, is called quantum theory. And quantum theory shows us that nature cannot be divided or reduced to basic building blocks. As we penetrate into matter, we don't see any fundamental building blocks or any fundamental substance. We see a complicated web of events, a web of relationships between various components of an integrated whole. Now, a further insight has been that this web of relationships is intrinsically dynamic. It is not a static web like a fisherman's net. It's a web of processes. And that insight was furthered by relativity theory, the second basic theory of modern physics. Einstein's theory of relativity showed that mass was equivalent to energy, that mass is a form of energy, so that every object has energy locked up in its mass. And this implies that these subatomic particles and various structures at this level are intrinsically dynamic. And that brings us to the whole concept of energy, about which we shall probably talk quite a bit. Energy in physics, as I think in everyday life, is always connected with activity, with work, with processes. You can define energy as a measure of activity. When you have a lot of energy, then you can be very active. That's our everyday experience, and that's also the scientific definition. It's often defined as the capacity for work, but a broader and maybe more useful definition would be a measure of activity. So particles have a certain mass, but this mass is a form of energy. So particles are bundles of energy, are bundles of activity, or patterns of activity. And to understand this better, we also have to realize that relativity theory, from which this insight emerged, that matter and that mass and energy are equivalent, relativity theory has brought us also the unification of space and time. The fact that you cannot just talk about space, you always have to talk about time. Whenever you say anything about space, you have to make an equivalent statement referring to time. The two are intimately and inseparably linked, and they form a four-dimensional continuum which we call space-time. Therefore, all forms at this level of investigation have to be seen as forms in space and time. Particles then are dynamic patterns which have a space aspect and a time aspect. In their space aspect, they appear as objects, and as such they have a definite mass. In their time aspect, they appear as processes, and as such they involve the equivalent energy. So you have these two pictures to play with, the space picture and the time picture, the mass picture and the energy picture, the object picture and the process picture. And these are not two different realities, but are parts of one and the same reality, which is a four-dimensional reality, a space-time reality. Now these energy patterns, or these dynamic patterns, make up atoms, molecules, liquids, solids, and the various structures that we observe in our environment. And at the everyday macroscopic level, it makes great sense to talk about a material substance. But when you go down to smaller levels, that concept loses its validity and its usefulness. We know that all the structures around us are made of atoms, and we know the atoms are made of particles, but the particles are not made of any stuff. There's no material stuff in a particle. There are dynamic patterns continually changing into one another, a continual dance of energy. So this is a profoundly interrelated picture and a profoundly dynamic picture that emerges from modern physics. Well, let me then go on and talk about the next question: what is life, or what are living organisms? And what I'm going to say here, as I said before, has really emerged in the last few decades, especially during the 70s, and is based on a view of living organisms which is called the systems view. It's also often called systems theory. And it is a view that I think is a natural extension of the concepts of modern physics and of the worldview of modern physics. So I will have to talk a little about this systems view before going into the question, what are living organisms, what are their characteristics. The systems view, as the term says, is concerned with systems which are integrated wholes that derive their properties from their interrelations rather than from the properties of their parts. So the systems view concentrates on interrelations and interdependencies of systems rather on the description or dissection into parts. Another way of saying this is that the systems view concentrates on principles of organization. So if we talk about two systems and if we say they are similar, what we mean is not that the content is similar. What we mean that the principles of organization are similar. And what are these systems? Well, there are living and non-living systems, and what I'm interested in here specifically are living systems. And living systems are just about everywhere you look. If you just look around, wherever you are, you will see living systems. We are, of course, living systems ourselves, and you can use the term synonymously with living organisms or living systems. So the human organism is a living system, and it contains other living systems within itself. For instance, the nervous system, as the term implies, is a system. The nervous system is a living system, or the digestive system. These are systems of organs connecting and comprising several organs. Then a single organ, like the liver, is a living system. And an organ is composed of tissues. And each of these tissues, a muscle or some other kind of tissue, is a living organism. And the tissue is composed of cells, and the cell is a living organism. And that's not the end. The cell is composed of smaller living systems, which are called organelles. So you have systems within systems, sort of like Chinese boxes, within one another. And the principles of organization that are characteristic of living systems apply to all of these systems, no matter what their size is or their function. Now, one other thing that I have to mention is that the systems view is an essentially dynamic view. And this is why I see it as a natural extension of the view of modern physics. It emphasizes interrelatedness, as we do now in physics, and it emphasizes the dynamic nature of systems, organization, process. According to the systems view, all structure of living organisms is a manifestation of underlying process. So you don't start with a structure and say, well, these are the basic building blocks. You go deeper and you talk about underlying processes and see structure as being formed, as being a reflection or manifestation of underlying processes. Now, what then are the principles of organization of living systems? Well, they can be summarized in a concept which is the concept of self-organization. Living systems are self-organizing systems, and what that means is, well, it really means what the word says, that they organize themselves. That is, they are relatively independent and autonomous vis-a-vis the environment. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you two examples to illustrate that. Well, the first one is, suppose you have a stone and you give it a kick. Then you can pretty much predict what the stone will do. Well, this, according to the direction of the kick and the momentum, the impulse, you can, just using straight Newtonian physics, you can predict the trajectory of the stone, or a football, or whatever you want to kick. Now, if you kick a dog, it's a very different story. There's no way of really predicting what the dog will do. The dog may run away, it may howl, it may bite you, it may do all kinds of things. Because the dog is a living system, it's self-organizing. That is, it will absorb that kick or avoid it or whatever, but it will process the information or the impact from the environment and then act according to whatever it feels like acting at that particular moment. And there's a power of decision, and there's an autonomy of living systems. Let me give you another example, which is a simpler one. Dealing with simpler systems. One very characteristic property of living organisms, of course, is that they grow. Unlike machines, which are constructed from fixed parts, living organisms grow. But everything that grows is not a living organism. And an example is a crystal. A crystal grows, but it's not a living organism because it's not self-organizing. And you can see that if you feed the crystal, so to speak, if you give it the appropriate chemicals in the appropriate mixture, the crystal will grow. And as long as you feed it, it will continue to grow. Now, if you do the same thing with a cell, it's a very different story. The cell will grow up to a certain point, and then, so to speak, it will say, this is it, this is my optimal size, this is where I stay. So the cell will not grow any further. Because it is self-organizing, it has an autonomy vis-a-vis the environment. So living systems are self-organizing systems. And if you want to, from the system's point of view, you can call this free will. You can say that free will is not just something that we observe in humans, it's something that reaches down all the way to the single cell, of course in a much more primitive form. But there is a faculty of decision, of reacting to the environment, not in a mechanical way, but on the basis of autonomy, of relative autonomy. Now, what are the more detailed expressions of self-organization? How does a living system organize itself? Well, there are a whole number of phenomena, of processes that are characteristic of self-organization. And let me just mention a few of them. One of them is that a living organism is always at work. It's never at rest, it's always at work. In order to stay alive, it has to take in energy, and it also has to take in structure. And that's what is known as metabolism. The process of metabolism consists in taking in energy and structure in terms of food, and breaking down the structure in the process of digestion, and then getting rid of the degraded products. And it's a whole, you can analyze the energy that goes into that, and you can talk about entropy, which is a measure of disorder, and you can analyze all that in various terms. It's a process of continual taking in of structure, breaking it down, and then excreting it, taking in energy and using this structure and energy to build up the parts of the organism. Now, in doing so, the living organism, as I said just before, doesn't grow and continue to grow, but what happens is that all its parts are continuously built up and broken down and then built up again. For example, a cell will continuously break down its structures and rebuild them. A cell has often been compared to a factory because you can say that it produces certain things like enzymes, and it stores them, and it transports them, and it exports them to other cells, and so on. It's a useful metaphor to compare a cell with a factory, except there's a crucial difference. All the parts of the cell, like the things corresponding to the buildings and the machines and the various things that the cell uses to do these things, all these parts are continually broken down and rebuilt. So a living organism changes and recycles its parts all the time. Every single cell does that. Then, of course, we know that the entire body changes its cells, and we know that cells die off and new cells are being formed, and this actually goes on at a very fast rate. I think the pancreas is the organ which recycles cells the fastest. All the cells of the pancreas are exchanged within 12 hours. It's a very fast rate of turnover. The stomach lining changes its cells every 3 days or so. And then, there are various other parts of the body that exchange cells also very fast. Don't please ask me why the pancreas does that or the stomach lining, but maybe somebody in the audience will know. But I've just heard from physicians that is the case, that this is a very rapid exchange. Now, in spite of this exchange, an overall structure is conserved. When I look, for example, at Dora Kunz, I haven't seen her for 4 years, and I walked in the door, and now I go, and of course I had no trouble recognizing her at all. No, she hasn't changed much. Well, she hasn't changed much in a sense, but all her cells have changed. Hardly a single cell in her body is the same as it was 4 years ago. And nevertheless, we have this stability, and you don't have to look at her, so you can look at each other. We all have this property of stability in spite of ongoing change. And this is characteristic of living organisms, continuous change, and nevertheless there is stability, an overall stability. And it's a stability of organization. You see, the parts are exchanged, and then there are new parts, but the overall organization remains the same. So there's self-renewal with stability. Then there's also self-healing as an important part of self-renewal. Living organisms can heal themselves or repair themselves, if you wish, when they are injured, and various kinds of organisms can do that to various extents. Organisms of a low level of complexity can regenerate themselves almost entirely. Certain worms, and it goes up to lizards, which can, I think, regenerate legs or at least tails, parts of their bodies. And then when you go to higher organisms, more complex organisms, this ability gets lost. But still, we still can regenerate cells and heal wounds and so on. So there's this process of self-healing, which is an important aspect of living organisms. Well, what else? There's adaptation. Adaptation to a changing environment. And this adaptation occurs in a way which is known as homeostasis. Homeostasis is a state of fluctuation where all the various quantities that you can measure, or the various variables or properties of an organism, would not have constant values but always fluctuate. For example, our body temperature is not at a constant value, it fluctuates between limits. Our brain waves, our hormone circulation, our blood flow, our, stomach chemistry, whatever you want to measure and define and observe, will be observed to fluctuate all the time. The entire organism is a system of fluctuations. And when you have adaptation, what happens is that you have an impact on the organism which will extend some of these fluctuations to their limits, or even beyond their limits. And that's known as the phenomenon of stress. When some of these, for instance, you run up a flight of stairs and you will start panting. It's because your heart rate is extended by the effort to a rate far beyond the normal rate of activity. And what the organism does in such a case is that all the other processes will somehow conspire to bring that heart rate down again. And then after a few minutes you will relax and the organism will adapt. Or when you go to a greater height, when you go from here to Peru or something like that, you will start panting and you will have this problem for a few days. But after a few days you will adapt. We will acclimatize. And this is known also as a kind of feedback. It's actually known as a negative feedback. When there's a deviation, the organism pulls back the function to its normal fluctuating values. Well, the various processes that I have mentioned so far, self-renewal, self-healing, adaptation, and so on, can all be seen as processes of self-maintenance. The organism has a tendency to maintain itself in a dynamic but stable state. What makes it difficult in understanding living organisms is that living organisms also have the opposite tendency. The opposite tendency is self-transcendence. Living organisms will continually tend to reach out into new territory, to transcend themselves and creatively form new structures and new functions and new states of being. And these are the processes of learning, of development and evolution. What happens there, if you want to use that model of fluctuations, is that you have certain fluctuations which, for one reason or another, will deviate either under stress or even spontaneously, and then the organism does not bring them back, but rather enforces the deviation. And that's known as positive feedback. It deviates even further until it comes to an instability. And from this state of instability, it will break through into a new state, where it will again be stable and fluctuating, but it will be a totally new state. This is, for example, what happens when you have a severe illness, which forces you to change your life, and you make some serious life changes, which will leave you a different person. So the illness would be the instability, the state of crisis, and afterwards you develop or evolve into a new state. Now it need not be illness. It can go through a process of meditation or any kind of process of self-realization or learning that also has this characteristic, and those of us who have had some experience in meditation or various practices know that there are states of crisis which you have and which you transcend eventually, and then you are in a new state. These are all these states of self-transcendence. And evolution is also the evolution of the species is also such a state of self-transcendence. Of course, we have a classical theory of evolution, the Darwinian and neo-Darwinian theory of evolution, and this theory is formulated in terms of genetics, in terms of mutations, adaptation, natural selection, and so on. Well, this is only part of the story. It's a very important part, but it's not the whole story. It does not tell you how an organism creates new structures, even without environmental pressure. You see, even without pressure from the environment, there is this tendency to evolve. If it were not there, then we would never have evolved beyond the blue-green algae, which are still around, which are now about 4 billion years old, which are extremely stable, extremely adaptive. You can boil them, you can freeze them, you can do all kinds of things with them, and they will survive. They are one of the most adaptive organisms existing on the planet, and yet, and once upon a time it was all algae and all bacteria and single-celled organisms, and yet they evolved, and there was this outreach into this tremendous new terrain of novelty. Now that is a characteristic of living organism, which has nothing to do with adaptation and selection and so on. So there are these two descriptions of evolution, and so far the two have not really been integrated, because this new theory of fluctuations and dynamic balance and self-transcendence is very new still, and it's not yet integrated with the other part. Well, these are basically some properties of living organisms, and the answer to the question, what is life, would be then that life is not a substance, and life is not a force or anything like that, but it is, you could say, maybe a set of processes which are characteristic for self-organization. And those are the processes I've just described, and there are some other ones. But there's no single answer you can give as a definition for life and say, it is this or it is that. It's a whole set of processes, and you can summarize them by saying it's the phenomenon of self-organization. Well, when you talk about living organisms, you can do so for quite a while without talking about mind. But sooner or later you will have to talk about mind when we include ourselves, and we know that we have a mind, and those of us who have cats or dogs or horses or whatever are pretty convinced that they have a mind too. So we have to deal with this question, what is mind? Well, let me at this point maybe mention some books. What I have said about living organisms and self-organization is written down very beautifully in a book called The Self-Organizing Universe by Jansch, Erich Jansch. I don't have a blackboard. It's spelled Jansch. Jansch, and it's called The Self-Organizing Universe. And what I'm going to say about mind is based on the work of Gregory Bateson. Gregory Bateson has written a book called Mind and Nature. And in this book, he defines mind as a property of living systems, and he says that any system that satisfies certain criteria, which he enumerates, any system that satisfies these criteria will have mind and will develop certain processes that we associate with mental activities. Processes like thinking, learning, remembering, and so on. And these criteria of mind apply to all living systems, not just organisms that have a nervous system. So it goes way down, actually down to the single cell. A single cell has mind because it satisfies these criteria, and I'll say in a moment what they are without going into too many details. And what it essentially is that mind is a process of taking in information, of perception, processing information, and deciding what to do with the information. That's sort of the purpose of mind at all levels of biological organization. And when you look at the detailed criteria that Bateson proposed for systems to have mind, then you find that these criteria are very similar to the criteria for self-organization that I've just described. And actually, I asked Bateson about this, and I said to him, well, these criteria of mind that you have set up look very much to me like the criteria for life. And he said, yes, you're right. He said, mind is the very essence of being alive. So now we have a situation where we can identify the criteria of mind with the criteria of self-organization, and therefore we can say that mind is the very essence of self-organization. The way I like to say it is that mind is the dynamics of self-organization. And this, to me, is really a tremendous development and a tremendous insight, which really for the first time goes beyond the Cartesian split between mind and matter. Because before, you always had matter on one side, and then you had mind on the other, and then the two were somehow interacting, and everybody was puzzled about how that interaction occurred, and so on. There was endless confusion about the brain and the mind. A certain phenomenon, is it the mind or is it the brain, and what is the relation between the two? Well, Bateson really cleared that up, I think, with one stroke. Now we can say that mind is an expression of matter. It is the way matter organizes itself in living organisms. It's the dynamics of self-organization. And all living organisms or living systems have this mind. Therefore, a single cell will have a mind. A tissue, a muscle or something has a mind. Of course, that doesn't mean that a muscle will now, write a poem. It doesn't have that kind of mind. It has a much more primitive and rudimentary mind, but it still is capable of mental activities. And it goes on all the way to the organs and organ systems, and the most complex of them, of course, being the brain, which consists of several parts that are organisms in their own right, and so there are several sub-minds. So the nature between mind and brain is quite clear then. The brain is an organ of the physical body, and mind is its dynamics. It's the way it organizes itself. It's the same as in the other living organisms. And so the human mind, then, what I would call the human mind, or the psyche, if you want to use that term, is the integrated whole of all these various levels of mind. all these various organisms have their minds, and they're integrated into a whole, which is the human mind. Now, let me talk about a few more consequences of this concept of mind. Well, first of all, we see that living systems don't end with individual organisms. They go beyond. We have social systems like a family. A family is a living system, a nation, a tribe, and so on. And all these living systems have minds, and when you talk about a group mind, the group mind of a family or of a group of people, you can now give this a scientific definition. You can say, to the extent that the group is self-organizing, and you can really define what you mean by that, to that extent it has a mind. And you also have mind in ecological systems. Ecosystems are also self-organizing living systems, and you could call them living organisms. It's sort of a matter of taste. I feel more comfortable talking about a system when I talk about an ecosystem rather than an organism, but the two are really equivalent. And so therefore ecosystems have mind, and this is something very, very significant, because you will deal with your natural environment very differently when you are aware that it is mindful like yourself, rather than a mechanical system, a machine, as Descartes believed. So this is a tremendous change of attitude. Once we become aware of the mindfulness of the ecosystem, that really changes our whole attitude towards it. Well, you can go on to larger systems, and one of the largest that we can think of is the planetary ecosystem. So the planet itself as a whole is also a living system or living organism, and there has been a theory or a hypothesis which is known as the Gaia hypothesis, which scientists have come up with to explain the various processes in the atmosphere, the various modes of self-regulation and self-organization of the planet. And what they have said is that the Earth cannot be understood properly unless you assume that it is a living organism as a whole. It does not only act like a living organism, it is a living organism. It is a living system with all these properties. And they have called it Gaia after the ancient Greek earth goddess. Well, and then you go on and you talk about the universe as a whole, and it's not far-fetched to assume, with a little help from our friends the mystics maybe, that the universe as a whole is also a living organism and therefore has mind. And of course then you are at a cosmic dimension, and the mind of the universe, well, it's what people call God, or what they call the divine, what they call cosmic consciousness, and so on. So you can now have a sort of a view which has a scientific basis, which says that God is the mind of the universe. And of course it sounds very beautiful and very poetic, but it also has a very concrete meaning. And to put it in scientific terms, you would say God is the dynamics of cosmic self-organization. Right? That would be the scientific version of saying that God is the mind of the universe. Now, before concluding, or in conclusion rather, I would emphasize that I have not talked about consciousness, and maybe many of you have missed that, and especially when talking about God and the cosmic mind and so on. We really have also to talk about consciousness, and according to the program this is on tomorrow, and so I will stop here, and tomorrow I'm going to extend this to talk about consciousness, but what I'm going to say tomorrow will be much more speculative and much less based on scientific models and theories. What I have said so far is really all based on results in modern science, although these are very recent results and known only to some of them to a small group of people, but they are to me extremely exciting results and make it really possible to have a fruitful dialogue and a stimulating dialogue with people like the people here in the Theosophical Society, people who come from spiritual traditions, and there's a real link now, to the results of modern science. Thank you. Yes?
I have just a comment, a short comment. What you would call mind seemed to me to be called behavior. So that you could describe it as behavior of lower organisms rather than mind.
Let me think about that. Mind and behavior. I guess you could say that.
It's more comfortable to me if you do it this way. Because the term mind conjures up cosmic notions. Frees my own mind to conclusions that aren't there if I use the term behavior.
Well, what about memory? Memory, is that part of behavior? See, I would include memory in my definition of mind. But can you talk about memory and behavior? Or thought?
Could you think of any evidence on the lower organisms, the single cell, for instance?
For memory? Oh yes, definitely. I should say that, I haven't done this research and I have had a lot of discussions with people, but that I remember. I couldn't give you an example, I'm afraid. But if you read that book by Jantsch, she talks about that. There's definitely memory. See, there's, for example, actually, just remember that people who do Reichian therapy would say that emotional memories are locked up in muscles. Now, this is something which we don't yet understand, but this kind of view of mind would sort of give you an avenue towards understanding that if a muscle is capable of memory because it's self-organizing, then you can sort of begin to get a feeling for what that might mean, that a muscle can have memory. So very definitely these systems theorists would say that these low organisms have memory. Yes?
If mind and the physical organism are always coexistent, what then happens to the mind when the physical disintegrates?
Good question. Well, I guess the mind would disintegrate too. And maybe we can come back to the question tomorrow when we talk about consciousness and discuss it. I really think it would be useful to discuss it in connection with consciousness, because there are various views of consciousness that would strongly disagree with that. But from that point of view of mind, I think the answer is pretty clear. Let me say, from that point of view, there's no mind without matter. I think that's quite clear. Therefore, when matter disintegrates, mind also disintegrates. Yes?
Now, you believe that the universe is finite, do you not?
I don't have any strong opinion on whether the universe is finite or not. Astrophysicists can't decide, and 1 year they believe it's finite, the other year they believe it's infinite. And
Didn't Einstein believe it was finite?
Einstein, I think, did, yes. But there are various cosmological models now that I'm sort of more comfortable with a finite universe rather than an infinite. But
The problem is when you say that mind is matter and then you relate mind to God, you begin to say God is finite rather than infinite. And I just wanted to point out that possible problem there.
yeah, I have no problem with God being finite. That's no. Still, when you talk about the universe as a whole, it goes so far beyond our concepts of space and time and causality and everything that you would still call it infinite in a, maybe Dr. Weber can help me here, in a philosophical sense, in the sense of not exhaustible by rational concepts. In that sense, the universe is infinite. But you can actually talk about its structure and say it has a finite or infinite structure. And that, I don't know. And yes?
Do you consider the mind strictly contained within the body?
No, that's very important. The mind is not strictly contained within the body. I'm very glad you asked that. because, and Bateson emphasized that very much, because there's this interaction between organisms and systems, and we partake in larger systems, and therefore we participate in larger minds. Therefore, something like the collective mind or the collective, well, tomorrow we'll talk about collective consciousness, and we'll make that jump from mind to consciousness, is something which is very consistent with that view and is required by that view. Bateson said that mind is not only immanent in individual organisms, but is immanent also in, how did he say, in the pathways and communications between organisms. For example, he would give the example of a computer. Does the computer have mind? The answer is no. The computer does not have mind, but the computer plus the engineer, the computer plus the computer programmer, this system has a mind which is larger than the mind of the engineer. See? Because they together again define a living system. So the answer to your question is definitely no, it's not contained in the organism.
If the mind isn't contained in the human body, then perhaps this man's question to you earlier, that is, the mind should not disintegrate.
Yeah, I was afraid somebody would say that. Well, this is really fun for me because I have worked out these concepts about maybe 2 or 3 months ago, and I'm sort of presenting it like a gospel to you, now I have to defend them. And you're completely right, and in that sense, you would say the mind does not integrate. That part of mind which participates in the collective, at least, would not disintegrate. I think that's a very good comment. Yes?
This was the point that I was making about the universe as a whole.
I see.
You can't just say that this is the mind, this is God's mind.
Mm-hmm.
Within the universe itself, it is much more than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, except that when you talk about the universe as a whole, whatever you say becomes very difficult because you really go beyond. What does it mean beyond the universe as a whole? I mean, if the universe is everything there is, there's no beyond, you see? So what happens is that these words really lose their meaning, and it's quite difficult then to talk about there. In the very back, yes?
See, I think some of the questions that have arisen revolve around a certain point, and I'd like to push that point a little bit. You've defined, let's use the example of brain and mind. Mm-hmm. Brain, you've said, is the organ of the living body, mm-hmm. okay? And mind is the way the brain organizes itself. Mm-hmm. Mind is the organization. Now, from the function you assign to mind, I don't know that you need the word at all. And it doesn't carry the weight, let's say, of what I imagine you'll assign to consciousness.
No.
And therefore, some of the questions that betray a little frustration, I understand, because why do you need the word mind? Why don't you just say organs of the body organize themselves? And I call that mind, but
yeah, but they think, they decide, they have free will. I mean, these are all concepts that were not usually associated with organs.
Could we explore what you mean by a cell that thinks?
Well,
yes?
The secret life of plants goes into it quite extensively. Right?
There? Yeah. Well, a cell, you see? A cell. I have to make jokes to diffuse the atmosphere because these are really difficult questions, and it gives me time to think a little, Well, a cell would, for example, a bacterium or something like that, would have a reaction vis-a-vis light and would choose to move in the direction of light or away from light. That would be a simple decision that a cell can make. And it is a decision which is based on perception, processing of perception, and then deciding what to do. And these are mental phenomena. You see, the idea is to extend the concept of mind down to very primitive, rudimentary phenomena, and then, move it all the way up to very complex systems, but to have a unified approach.
But do you think that each individual cell has that sense of decision.
Yes.
This is what you stated earlier.
Yes, yes. Now, in a compound of, say, a muscle or a part of the skin, the cell may not have an opportunity to use it or use it often, I don't know. But when you have a single cell, which is an individual organism, like a bacterium, then it certainly does have that power.
You're focusing on matter. Why not focus on like an energy field as an organizing power? And then instead of saying that all matter has mind and self-organization, why not put the organizing as entirely external to matter?
Well, that's what I was going to do tomorrow. That was what I was going to tomorrow when I talk about consciousness. And I think it's a good policy to keep back the best part till the next day, because then everybody comes back. and that would be what I would call the mystical view or the spiritual view. And let me just say that I don't say all matter has mind. I'm talking about a specific structures of matter that form living matter, living organisms. In this view, a rock does not have mind. See, that's another. I just think that this concept of mind gives very clear answers to these, age-old questions. The answers may be wrong, they may not be right, but at least we have a very clear conceptual framework, and we can test it and then see whether it's viable. A rock would not have mind. Yes.
I have two questions. One is, when you say that the quantum theory causes us to think that things are whole and undivided. I'm confused, and I'd like to clear that up, because my notion is quantum theory means energy equals h nu, and quantum theory says that energy comes in packets, in pieces, and it's hard for me to relate that to the notion that quantum theory indicates that there's an undivided wholeness. That was one question.
Yes. Maybe I should answer that first. Quantum theory does both. And the discovery that energy comes in packets was the beginning of quantum theory. And then it moved on, and people discovered that these packets, which were called quanta, and gave the name to the theory, a quantum of energy, that they were particles. And now we don't talk about quanta any longer, we talk about particles, and they're called photons, the particles of light and electromagnetic radiation. And then it went on further, and the quantum physics, or the quantum mechanics, as they called it in the old days, was the mechanics of these quanta as compared to the mechanics of Newtonian objects. And then they discovered, they found out these quanta are really particles, and then they studied the phenomena involved in these particles, and then they discovered the uncertainty principle, and that these particles are really interconnections or correlations, and then the whole other side came in. So both is part of quantum theory. Okay, now you had another question.
The second question is a confusion that relates. You do experiments in the laboratory, physical experiments, and in these experiments, you send high energy particles into a nucleus, and you get certain results, so that you get data from your laboratory that are created under very specific defined conditions.
Yes.
And I can see in that circumstance, the observer is creating the observations in a sense, because of the instrumentation.
Yes.
Now, you then move from that and the data that you get there, you move into the area of people, there is basically a wholeness.
Yes.
Or perhaps a situation that the observer is the observed. Perhaps statements like that in terms of relationships among people. And I'm wondering about that movement from specific observation, specific data under those conditions, to generalizing into the movement from physics to metaphysics.
Yes, there's a big jump there, it seems. But see, what happens is that Heisenberg discovered and had to realize that every observation disturbs the phenomenon. And this is what he expressed then in the uncertainty principle. So, as you say, you bombard a nucleus, and that's the only way to observe it. There's no other way we can observe a nucleus or an atom or subatomic particle than by bombarding it with light or with some other kind of radiation or something. And that light at that level also appears as particles and just impinges on the nucleus. Now, when I observe you, when I look at you, I also would switch on the lights, because otherwise I wouldn't see you, and I also bombard you with photons. But you don't notice that, and it doesn't disturb you, because this is a very light influence. However, the influence is there. It's just that when we talk about ordinary macroscopic phenomena, the disturbance is so slight that we can neglect it. And then we get this notion of objective phenomena independent of the observer. But the dependence is always there, just it's so light that it isn't very relevant. However, it is very relevant when we talk about personal relationships. For example, in therapy, it's very important. The effect of the therapist on the patient is a very important one, as you know, all of us who have thought about medicine and therapy know. So in that field, again, it's a different situation, and the observer-observed relationship becomes very crucial. So you can extend it from the subatomic realm to other realms, although there is some extrapolation involved, but I think it's fully justified. Yes?
Yes. Have you ever investigated or read up on any clairvoyant observations of subatomic particles?
No.
Because there's a Theosophical book that was written by in the late 1800s, early 1900s by Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater that was on the clairvoyant observations of atomic particles. And I was just suggesting it might be interesting to read. They have some ideas of matter being bubbles in some sort of ocean-like density, etc.
Yeah, I'll look into that.
I could show it to you later.
She was the one who discovered Krishnamurti. Is that the woman who was related to Krishnamurti? Yeah. Okay, I'll look into that. Yes.
Let's go back to that question that the fellow asked earlier about the very special laboratory conditions.
Yes.
He asked basically, how can you extend that knowledge to generalizations of what's happening?
Yes.
Really, let's restate the question. How can you state we can measure certain things in the bubble chamber? We can say certain things are going to happen under certain conditions. Okay, but the bubble chamber is not occurring now. How can we state these relationships about protons under collisions and then make statements about atoms and nuclei that are not undergoing collisions? In the normal state, they don't do that.
Well, they don't do that. They don't do that in most of the phenomena that surround us. But they do it very often in the atmosphere of the Earth,
the
cosmic rays, and they do it in the interior of stars. So what we do in the laboratory is to recreate a situation of an extreme situation which occurs naturally. It's not an unnatural situation, but it's a rare situation.
All right, was restating a third way then. To state that a nucleon has a certain characteristic set of parameters and phenomena under collision circumstances, what does it really say about the nature of that nucleon under non-collision circumstances, which is the 99% of all matter?
Well, it doesn't say anything directly. Right, it says things by extrapolation, and it's the same kind of question that when I say, well, look at this table. There's this beautiful bouquet of flowers, and I can describe it white and red, roses and whatever they are, and I describe the wood of the table and anything. And I would look at it, and then I turn around and I describe it and say, well, now you don't look at it any longer. Is it still there? It's the same kind of question. And I believe in a continuity of natural phenomena. So I say I can look at it and then turn away and then describe it. The same way I can measure the mass of a neutron during a collision, and I believe that after the collision it will still have the same mass. And the same charge. In that case, it doesn't have a charge. It will be electrically neutral. And I believe that this will still go on. And I can do this also because I can have a neutron, or say a proton, colliding here. And then I have it travel from here to here. And I have a whole range of detectors around. And I know that there's no other particle interfering. So that when I measure a proton in the second place, I know it's the same proton, that nothing else has happened. And I observe the same mass and the same charge and the same isospin and whatever properties we measure. And so I conclude that in the way in between it has also had these properties. So it's that kind of argument.
You raise an interesting speculation with regard to the autonomy you were referring to in your talk, the autonomy of a cell when you begin to examine it at different levels of structure. In other words, the cell in the human body versus the whole human being.
Yes.
And you were relating to mind and how at different levels it relates to the physical entity. The particular mind you referred to related to the cell, particular mind you related to the human being, and the autonomy it represents in different conditions, and yet at the same time it seems that never get away from an interrelationship. And if I'm interpreting the things that I've read you saying, it's very difficult to even talk about autonomy of a human being or a cell, because invariably they're in relationship with others, other peers.
Right. You always have to talk about relative autonomy, and what happens is a very significant phenomenon, I think, that at these levels of systems, at each level, you have entities that are wholes, organisms, like cells, and at the same time there are parts of larger wholes, like tissues. And the tissues are wholes and a part of larger wholes, the organs, and so on and so on. So at each level you have these entities that are wholes and parts at the same time. And there has to be a balance between those two qualities. As wholes, they have to have a self-assertive tendency that gives them the autonomy vis-a-vis their environment. They have to be self-assertive and maintain their individuality. And I haven't talked about individuality, but that's also a property of living systems, that they have individuality. No two are exactly alike. Now, as parts of larger wholes, these same entities have to integrate themselves into the functioning of the larger whole. So they have to have these self-assertive and integrative tendencies. And both of them are necessary, and there has to be a dynamic interplay. And when you make a jump to social systems, you can say, and I do this actually in my book, that in the new book, that our society now is characterized by too much self-assertion and not enough integration. So we have competition and expansion and these various values which are self-assertive, which are also masculine values, and not enough integration, intuition, yielding, cooperation, conservation, and so on, which are feminine or integrative values. And that's, I think, a very interesting consequence of this systems view.
What is a photon?
A photon is a particle of light. It has either a particle nature, then we call it a photon, or it has a wave nature, then we call it an electromagnetic wave. So,
does it have weight?
Does it have weight? Well, yes and no. It has a mass, but usually a physicist would say a photon is massless because it does not have what we call a rest mass. It does not just sit there, but it has energy when it flies along at the speed of light, and that energy is equivalent to a certain mass, and in that sense it has weight. That was a result of relativity theory, that light has a weight. And you know, when they tested the theory, Eddington went, I think, to Africa or somewhere where they had a solar eclipse, and he could observe the bending of light around the sun. And that was a prediction that Einstein made, because the light has a mass or has weight, as you say. Okay.
This talk will continue on the next CD.
Yes.
In your system, what causes the evolution of the non-stressed algal system?
Well, what they say, you know, I've talked to these systems people, and they say it's spontaneous and it's unpredictable, and it's a spontaneous. I can give you a little more detailed answer. The living organisms are seen as fluctuating systems. Everything is always in fluctuation, and every now and then, as I've said before, one of these fluctuations will be extended, and then there will be an instability and so on. And that's a spontaneous process which is inherently unpredictable. Now that's what I have learned from these systems theorists, but I really don't know more about it. So I can't give you an example or even defend it. But
how is that different from Darwin?
It's different from Darwin because in Darwin, there is adaptation and natural selection. There's mutation, and the mutation is spontaneous. But then there's natural selection and adaptation. And the mutation alone doesn't create, I don't know, a leg out of a fin or something like that, or doesn't transform a tail into something else. But in this view, in this system's view, there's a spontaneous transformation which occurs. But as I said before, the two views are not really reconciled yet. You know, you have one kind of view which is part of the story, and you have another kind of view, and it also makes sense. But if you try to put them together, it's very difficult.
It seemed to me you were making a point of this evolution as originating from the mind of that organism, which
Yes.
I think is an unjustified extension, because you have brought forth no data to support it, and you really retreat to the kind of argument that Darwin originally used, which only supports his concept, not yours.
No, I haven't really related evolution to mind. Well, I guess you could, or you should, if you say mind is the dynamics of self-organization and evolution is an important part of it. So it would be a kind of mental phenomenon. But I can really not. I know that there are data that support it. And the data come from systems that Prigogine has studied, which he has called dissipative structures. These are very simple systems. They're actually chemical systems. They're not living organisms, but they have this property of fluctuation and self-organization. And they can be shown to evolve spontaneously into other kinds of states. And this model has then been applied to other types of evolution. But this question of what causes it and to what extent is it spontaneous is really a question I can't answer. That is something I have to look into at a later time. Yes?
I was wondering that when we talk about things that are spontaneous, I wonder if we really know what we're talking about. Because in my way of looking at it, if everything is mind, or even in the way that you're describing it, that maybe something that we're looking at that seems spontaneous to us has an intent. And it wasn't all that spontaneous, but we just didn't tune into the intent, and maybe don't have any way of tuning into the intent of the object
Yes.
or entity or system or whatever it is. So it's a very unsatisfactory way of...
Yeah, you're right. Whenever a scientist says spontaneous, then it's covering up the ignorance, They talk about spontaneous remission of cancer, for instance, just because they don't know. It's the self-healing of the organism. Somebody meditates for 3 months and then gets rid of her tumor, and they call it spontaneous remission. It's not spontaneous at all. It's premeditated, and involves a lot of effort. Or they say the neutron decays spontaneously, just because they don't know what the various connections are. You're completely right. Yes.
The relationship between your notion of mind and thinking, thought, as
Yes.
memory, experience, knowledge, how does that relate to mind?
Well, I would say...
Is there mind or thought?
I would say yes. You can have mind without thought. Depends what you mean by thought. I would say, primitive levels of organization would not think. I don't think that a cell thinks.
Thinking in the sense of a response of memory or experience or knowledge.
Well, I would say let me say that abstract thought. I'm not sure about, but I think abstract thought would require consciousness. Would require symbolic language and all that, which really comes in with the human mind. I don't think you can talk usefully about thinking at much lower organisms. And at the higher level, I would say thought is a property of mind.
So that mind, for instance, occurs without any electrical activity in the brain, with no correlate.
No, there can be correlates. Why not? Sure. Yeah, the mind. Well, mind occurs.
Is mental activity measurable? Would it cause meters to move?
Yeah. Yes. If you, in principle, I don't know, which meters you would use and where you would plug them in and stuff like that. But in principle, yes. Well, let's talk about mental energy. Well, mental energy would be the energy that is involved in the physical activities of self-organization, that give rise to these mental phenomena and would be measurable. So if you sit at a desk and work very hard and have this mental energy, that should be measurable. And for instance, I have made the experience that when I work a lot intellectually and I have a nervous fatigue, then nothing is better than eating vegetarian meals. However, when I work physically and say go skiing or something, then it's nice to eat meat. I don't know how this would relate to the various different types of energies, but questions like this one should be able to answer when you measure mental activity versus physical activity. Yes?
Can you talk more about the ways that Bateman's work has influenced you at all?
Yes, Bateman's work has influenced me very strongly. The strongest influence was that when I branched out from physics to other areas, I had to very much extend my concepts and modify my concepts. When I started that, I had the tendency to see everything with the eyes of a physicist and in terms of physics. And Bateson really knocked me out of that, in a very dramatic way. I met him several times and had discussions with him. And I know when he met me, he said to somebody else who is, a common friend, he said, "Capra is crazy. The man thinks we're all electrons." That was his first comment, So that really jolted me, and made me aware that I really had to do some work and change my concepts. So that was Bateson's major influence. More specifically, what I have used in my book is his view of homeostasis and adaptation, this sort of cybernetic view of living organisms, and what I just said, his concept of mind. Yes?
You used the word homeostasis different than what I had understood it in the past. I'd understood stasis meaning remaining the same.
Yes.
And yet I understood you to say that it is, and I can appreciate the concept of fluctuations within a range.
That's right.
But then I also thought I understood you to say that a part of homeostasis is those times when we go beyond. Now, were you talking about a different...
No, that's not a part of homeostasis.
Okay.
I don't think so, no.
Homeostasis is...
Yeah, it's the stability, the dynamic stability. That's how I understand it. Yeah. Yes?
You talked about your forthcoming book.
Yes.
Talks about the various crises while you're facing.
Yes.
So you would characterize the current period of crisis as even healthy, because that's a self-transcending activity of ecosystem.
Yes, I think you can have that view, except this crisis is different from all the others I think we had before because of the possibility of self-destruction, through nuclear weapons. So that's a major difference. And that is something which we always have to keep in mind and, oppose relentlessly. But apart from that, I think it may be very healthy.
It means parts of the system now have to, put it together, or how would you describe? Because the total system is facing destruction, then what could the parts do?
Yes, well, the way I see it is that cultures and civilizations rise and fall. And, if you just study history, they go up and down. And what happens is, as one, see, you have this curve right here of rise and fall. And as one civilization goes down, parts of it, well, first let me say it goes down because it becomes rigid and cannot adapt to new situations. And while it goes down, parts of it reorganize themselves and already form the seeds to the new civilization which is rising. And in the period of transition and crisis, you have this rising culture and the declining culture. And that's what we're seeing now. We have this, what Rosa called the counterculture, which I like to call the rising culture. And then you have the declining culture. And the period of transition is a very difficult period because the declining culture typically, instead of changing and adopting the new views, holds on even more to the old views. And that's what we've seen in the last election and in the current political situation. There's a conservative backlash because people think that, well, if we could just get back the good old times, but the good old times, won't come back. If they were good in the first place, I don't know. But even if they were, there's no way of bringing them back. We have a new situation, and we have to change. And this resistance against change makes the system even more rigid. And biologically, this happens with species that get extinct, of course. And such species are, Chrysler and General Motors, and these are the dinosaurs in our culture. And they have either to change or they will get extinct. So, yes?
I've thought quite a bit about whether the way science goes about studying things is actually really a relevant way of studying life, because I've thought quite a bit about what is life too, and I agree with you, it's a pretty complicated matter, but I've thought that if someone, in other words, I thought that the idea of intent is very important when describing life, and that if someone were to come into this room, say, from another kind of a order, and it was made up of some different kind of a strange system that couldn't comprehend us, and maybe he thought we were alive or he didn't, or whatever, he thought we were quasi-alive, and he started describing what's going on here to a fellow of his own kind, and all he was doing is describing processes and things happening, interrelationships and different kinds of things, purely descriptive on that level. I think he would have lost, some of the essence of what's really going on here.
Yeah.
I don't think he would have really thought.
That's right. That, by the way, is what behaviorists do. They describe things, on a very descriptive phenomenological level, and they understand a lot of things about psychology and behavior, but they lose the very essence.
Yeah. Well, the idea that we're ever really going to get to a real satisfying understanding of what life is without a deep-rooted understanding of the intent of processes that are occurring in the universe by some sort of intelligence that maybe is directing them. Maybe we're part of that, but it seems to me without an understanding of the intent of these processes, whatever description you come up with is very unsatisfying at some real deep level.
Well, again, I would like to refer this discussion to tomorrow when we talk about consciousness, but I'm not sure. As you were talking, I was trying to think whether intent would be included in this definition of mind. And I really don't know. Probably yes, but I'm not sure. And maybe I'll think about it until tomorrow and try to remember. Yes?
In your view, would something like sociobiology be part of the Cartesian worldview?
Oh yes, very much so. Entirely, because it's based on genetic determinism. It says things are determined by the genetic blueprint. It's very similar to, social Darwinism would be one of its precursors.
What contemporary psychological theory would then correspond with yours?
What contemporary psychological theory?
Yeah. In lieu of sociobiology.
Well, sociobiology is not a psychology, is it?
That's behavioristic psychology.
Yeah. It doesn't talk about the psyche or anything like that, the mind or anything like that. Well, the contemporary theories of psychology would be humanistic psychology, transpersonal psychology, Jungian psychology, but also Freudian psychology and various models which address themselves to various levels of consciousness and of the psyche. You see, I think the beauty of the systems view is that as you have different levels of systems and systems within systems and so on, you will have different models to describe them. And also, I would say that behaviorists lose the very essence, but I think at the same time it's extremely useful. It's a very useful description, but it's not the whole story. Nor is psychoanalysis, nor is humanistic psychology or any other. And what I see as coming is a science where we have a network of models or a mosaic of models, different languages being used for different phenomena, and the entire network would give you a whole picture. And the mistake in the past was that, especially in psychology, that people thought they had the whole answer, and Freud thought he really knew about what the psyche is all about, and Jung thought it, and Reich thought it, and Adler thought it, and so on, and not realizing that they were contributing various pieces to the puzzle. And our aim in the systems approach would be to make these consistent with one another. And this is the approach that I'm applying in my new book when I talk about health and healing and healthcare, that you have various therapeutic techniques and they are valid for various cases. And you can use medical therapy and you can use homeopathy and you can use body work and you can use therapeutic touch and you can use all kinds of therapies if you have a framework where they fit together and are mutually consistent, because they would apply to different cases and different situations. In the back?
Yes. Have you read the book Lifetime by Watson?
No. I know Lyle Watson and I've read his first one, Supernature, but I haven't read that Lifetime. It's one of the books that is on my list. I have it at home, but I haven't read it. Do you think I should?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes?
When you touch on consciousness, will you be touching on this from a laboratory standpoint, or have you personally had any experience in, or are you conversant with mind-to-mind communication and the use of the mind in healing and the use of the mind in prediction and so forth?
No, I will talk about these things. I haven't done any research about mind or consciousness or any, except for reading other books and talking to other people. And what I will say about consciousness will be much more speculative than what I say today. And what we will do is that Renee Weber will talk first and present a sort of historical view of consciousness as it has been viewed in different cultures and different traditions. And I will then add my 2 cents at the end and say it from the point of view of science and the systems view. You can also say that and that and that and that, and then we'll discuss that. And it will all come out of my experience and not out of any laboratory work.
This segment of the program has now concluded. The next segment will begin momentarily.
My part then in the presentation is to be the metaphysician to the physicists. So we have physics and metaphysics. And I think that has both advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are that as a metaphysician, if you like, from the point of view of a philosopher, I can approach the topic of consciousness virtually in any way I like, in any manner in which humankind has thought about the subject from the beginning. And that's, in fact, what I've done. I have allowed my thoughts to range over the recorded tradition in philosophy, in religion, most particularly what I like to think of as esoteric philosophy, the esoteric tradition, both East and West, ancient and modern, but let's say ancient is my predilection. And I've allowed the very large questions and answers to enter the remarks that I'm going to make this afternoon. That, I would say, is the advantage, all right? It's consciousness or thought ranging freely over its universe without fear of being held accountable in the same strict empirical manner in which the scientist, the physicist, is held accountable for his data. So I am not going to tie myself down by any notion at this moment, although you can bring this up as freely as you like in the question and answer session. I'm not going to tie myself down in as strict a manner as a physicist would have to the preoccupation of evidence or documentation. In short, for those of you who are scientists or in philosophy, I will state at the outset that though I'm quite well conversant with Occam's razor, as it's known, the principles of Occam's razor, which states that parsimony must at all costs be preserved. You mustn't multiply your hypotheses beyond strict need. So though I am aware of Occam's razor, I was raised with it as a philosopher in my professional training, I'm going to ignore Occam's razor today for the purposes of my presentation. The second thing I'd like to say is, though I will tackle the subject of consciousness from a wide range indeed. I'm the universe, so to speak. I'm going to go straight to my target, if you like, and talk about the universe as a whole, or what underlies it, in my view. I'm also aware of the fact that anything I'm saying this afternoon is metaphorical. All of this is the map, as the saying now goes. It is not the territory. I am not laying out the universe for anyone's inspection, in as much as that's quite impossible. This is map making. It's not the territory, it is the map. And what that means is, all that I will say, all that I will try to evoke is, to some degree, metaphor, as all language is metaphor. Isn't that right? The map draws the boundaries, guides, evokes, approximates, describes in its own fashion, but it is a good map maker is under no illusion as to the duplication of map and territory. And so, having said that, I want to divide my subject at the outset roughly into three kinds of categories, into three questions. And again, I'm very mindful of the fact that I'm leaping boldly where Fritjof last night inched his way very soberly and cautiously. But that's somewhat a choice on my part at the moment. So I'm going to ask three questions about consciousness: the what, the how, and the why. Under the what, I want to describe what I think has been taught for thousands of years in especially the Eastern traditions, the mystical traditions of both East and West, certainly in Theosophy, and all of these have a common thread running through them, and that common thread is what I am distilling and presenting without necessarily identifying whether it comes from any given tradition. I will say at the outset that what I've drawn on is Theosophy in the secret doctrine, the proem in particular. This also comes from one of the 6 classical systems of Indian philosophy, Sankhya, out of which yoga comes as a second system, and it would fit a good part of Mahayana Buddhism and to some degree Platonism. But we'll ignore the labels. The what? People who have reflected on consciousness within that tradition have begun their reflections by asserting that there is a source to everything that is, a background, if you like, to the foreground of the universe. And that background, or that basic source, is simply incapable of being described. However, that having been acknowledged, people have tried in their own way to describe it. And some of the words that have come up, which are self-limiting, self-critical words, are that it's beyond language, that it's beyond being and non-being, that it's ultimate, that it's boundless, that it cannot be limited, it's eternal, it's not in time, etc., etc. And having said that, everyone has always been careful to note that literally this background source, or ultimate reality, if you like, can't be known. It's unknown and unknowable if by knowledge we mean conscious, explicit, conceptual, verbalizable knowledge. All right, so much for the background, and I'm postulating as my hypothesis that that's the ultimate ground where one must begin in one's inquiry into the fundamentals of consciousness. Now, it has always been noted in all the metaphors, in the myths, in the traditions, in the metaphysics, that if you stay with that, there is nothing more to say. That's it. So out of that, we cannot get a good schema, even an approximative schema, a good map of consciousness or of the universe. And so one must go a step beyond that and explain that that would not account for the universe as we know it, or ourselves as conscious beings, self-aware beings within that universe. And so very early on, it's noted that in order for that unmanifest source to produce the kind of universe that you and I are trying to understand, something further has to happen. It has to manifest itself in some way. And the way it manifests itself, I would call the reflection of the source, the outcome of the source in some manifest, I haven't yet said tangible way because it's not yet at that stage, but manifest way. The reflection then of that source beyond being and non-being in a world of being. And that has been summed up, and that's where our subject in particular comes in, as a polar, dual reflection, one at its source, and one polarity one calls consciousness, the other polarity one calls matter-energy. The two are basically one. I've already said that. They're grounded in the one. They express their expressions of the one. I'm not reintroducing Cartesian dualism. Far from it. I'm saying that by the time something is palpable enough to form worlds, there seems to be a polar character to the way it behaves itself, and we can call the one unconditioned consciousness, the other a kind of basic root substance, root matter, root energy, in Sanskrit mula prakriti and parabrahman, or Purusha and Prakriti. I don't think the words matter so much, but let's say a more objective pole and a more subjective pole. And the insistence of all these traditions is that though the language, the map-making, forces this kind of language upon us, these kinds of terms upon us that sound dualistic, the insistence is, on the part of all these traditions, that at root they are one. So you never have subject without involvement in object, object without involvement in subject. You never have the hopeless divorcement between matter and consciousness of, let's say, the Cartesian universe. If you want to link this to Western figures in philosophy, the philosophers to whom this fits very beautifully are Spinoza in the 17th century, who was a non-dualist. He's the most uncompromising monist that I know of in the West. And he says the universe is one, there's but one reality, but the way it can be grasped is under two attributes or characteristics, and one is consciousness and one is extension. So you have that in Spinoza, and in the 19th century in Hegel. And both of them would fit really into the esoteric tradition that I'm developing. Now, another, I think I'll only bother with one quote, although I have many nice ones, but this one I think is an interesting one because it deals precisely with this very early process, if you like, at the point at which this original source seems to bifurcate itself functionally, though not at ground, as I've tried to stress. And the quote comes from, it's really sort of the invocation or dedication quote of Ken Wilber's very fine book called The Spectrum of Consciousness, in which he suggests something along these lines. It's a quest book. You can get it here if you like. And his quote is from G. Spencer Brown, Laws of Form. And G. Spencer Brown is a mathematician, a very philosophical mathematician. And he says it as follows. I mean, he's commenting now on this seemingly inevitable dualism we're forced on the moment we try to understand and conceptualize. And G. Spencer Brown writes as follows. Thus, we cannot escape the fact that the world we know is constructed in order to see itself. But in order to do so, evidently, it must first cut itself up into at least one state which sees and at least one other state which is seen. Now that, I think, gives, if you like, a kind of motivation for the kind of dualistic language that one is forced to pursue when one tries to account for the source of consciousness, its outcome in the daily world, and its reflection in what we call ourselves or human aspects of this universal consciousness. It runs a little bit ahead of my story because it gives motivation. It talks about the why. In order to see itself and come to itself and grasp itself, consciousness has made itself into offspring called a world, matter, and so forth. So the non-dualistic notion of consciousness and matter as they exist inseparably as what's been called the field of all conditioned being gives rise then to the cause of the world, and from that come the much more familiar forms of the universe. In occult literature, it's called the great breath, with which comes into being an interaction between consciousness and matter. And that interaction, that polar relationship, which goes on all the time, introduces motion or movement into this schema. And with motion and movement, we therefore have time, rhythm, periodicity, the great breath, if you like. The potential creative power, sometimes called divine eros. In Theosophical language, it's called fohat, which is like an underlying energy that activates the interplay between consciousness and matter. So the first thing then, I'd like to summarize this what. The what of the matter is this groundless, immutable, boundless source that's always been, that then gives rise to these other expressions. Now the second factor that I would like to emphasize is that in all these traditions, there is tremendous emphasis placed on periodicity. So much so that in the Secret Doctrine, for example, the very second fundamental proposition that Madame Blavatsky asserts is the law, as she calls it, a universal law of periodicity that applies to all entities in the universe, from atoms, or we would say subatomic entities, to human beings, to universes themselves. Nothing stands still. Everything is dynamic, and it isn't just randomly dynamic, but it's dynamic with a kind of rhythm. And so the notion of cycles, life and death of organisms, activity and rest, manifestation and latency, pralaya and manvantara is said to run through all the life action of the universe, and to induce a kind of pattern or rhythm or really harmony, this constant dynamic process of life, which by the way is defined here as the interface between matter and consciousness. And this creates or gives rise to a universe that's alive. Some people would characterize it as intelligent, orderly, dynamic, and this isn't just random. So now I'm starting to come to really the heart of what I want to say this afternoon. I'm going to violate another almost sacred dictum of science, and that is I'm going to introduce the notion of purposiveness. Purpose, intent, meaning, teleology, we call it in philosophy, telos, purpose. That's in a way a sin, and I'm sinning in public on Sunday, but I've done it, and I'm going to speak teleologically, because I don't just want to describe this whole system. I would like to try to explain it, and explanation for humans seems to involve, whether validly or invalidly, recourse to meaning and purpose and connectedness of that to some kind of value. It isn't neutral, it's not value-free, it has these other dimensions indissolubly interconnected with it, and if that factor is absent, one might say, and I might say that along with others, you've given me a good description, but have you really given me an explanation? All right, and that, of course, opens a whole large issue. I'm aware of that. It introduces one of the hardest issues in the philosophy of science. What is an explanation? When is a description an explanation? And when is a description not an explanation anymore? So I've simplified my life, I admit it, and I've dragged in teleology, purposiveness, because it appeals very deeply to not only my intuition, but even my reason. And so I'm going to ask these questions. And so to go back, the universe is, under this view of consciousness and matter and energy and life, a dynamic process, an activity. It isn't random. It isn't one-dimensional or flat. It doesn't just have an indifferent direction, but it has a thrust, an impulse behind it in a given direction, and I think it's there that possibly I may run into trouble with my colleague, my scientific colleague here, because that's claiming a great many things for it, and I'm aware of that. And so under this account, the Theosophical Eastern account, the claim is that this one holistic or whole kind of consciousness involves itself in matter. There's an involution, to use Sankhya, the Sankhya principle and the Theosophical notion, and then it evolves back out. And that isn't just busy work, but it has a purpose and a meaning. Something gets accomplished in this process that could not get accomplished in other ways. That's the claim at any rate. And so consciousness, matter, life, even mind, to use a term that Fritjof used in a careful sense last night, it's said to pervade all the worlds and all the beings in their own way and in ways appropriate to their kind. I would argue a cell is conscious in its own way, though that the meaning of consciousness for the cell has a different sense from the meaning of consciousness or self-consciousness of an organism like mankind, and yet another sense for the enlightened consciousness who operates habitually in different laws of space and time from my own, let's say. So every particle of matter somehow is imbued with consciousness appropriate to its level of organization, and the universe evolves. That original consciousness must pass through in ways that I do not fully claim to understand. I mean, the logistics of it, the traffic pattern is staggering, but in ways that involves experiencing an enormously rich variety of situations, viewpoints, if you will, expressions of that one reality, going from the mineral kingdom, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, with increasing levels of complex organization and feedback mechanisms through the human. And I conceive, along with these traditions, that it is entirely logical that there should not be an arbitrary stopping point with the human species, and therefore metahuman consciousness, to me, would be a logical outcome of this theory of evolution in which variety and intelligence, if you will, of experience is sought. So the universal mind, this background, is then said to be to organize itself hierarchically in an ordered, organized way, harmonically. I don't have time to develop that, but that enters in, and the evidence that's given for this harmonic pattern to its organization is usually drawn from two specific disciplines which are connected, as Pythagoras was the first to point out in 5th century BC Greece, namely mathematics and music. And the claim is that the universe is a self-consistent, self-organizing, alive, self-aware, conscious system, mathematical and musical in kind. It has pattern. It isn't random, as David Hume would have argued, as Jacques Monod would have argued in a book called Chance and Necessity. It isn't that kind of system, but if we're going to make a map, this map is a better one. And the Hermetic principle, right, as above, so below, applies. Man, therefore, is a microcosm, a very powerful microcosm of the macrocosm, and he exhibits the same laws. The direct existential, if you like, application of this is that he who studies himself, herself in depth, as far as one can, understands also thereby something about the universe as a whole. Now I'll come directly to my third system, and my third point, the why. This is where the sinful part emerges, and that is to postulate purposes and reasons for all this. I will state my reservation about the scientific map making, though I love science and respect it very deeply and enjoy reading it to the best of my ability. Science, I think, on this third point, cannot say very much. It doesn't wish to, it doesn't think that is its appropriate subject matter. And so in the esoteric traditions, in the Theosophical view, the why can be stated. And the way it's sometimes stated is that there is a cycle of necessity, this evolutional dynamic thrust of every particle of consciousness dash matter in the universe, and it's a kind of pilgrimage, all right? The return home, if you will, the estrangement from the source in order, after having ranged the cosmos to, in all ways possible, richness of experience and understanding, in order then to come back to one's original starting place with a difference, namely wiser, better, purer. I mean, there are so many terms that would take me an hour. The fundamental identity of the spark with the flame, of the individual soul with the universal oversoul, HPB says, the figure and the ground reunited, so Brahman and Atman in Hinduism, the field of consciousness, its Buddha nature, reintegrated with the localized manifestation of that field. And so this journey and its homeward point, I think, bring together not just metaphysical, cosmic, physical concepts, but moral concepts, not just psychological, but really ethical concepts. And what this implies is, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the notion of karma. Karma is the law of action and reaction, and it would directly apply to this metaphysical journey, this pilgrimage. I shouldn't call it metaphysical, it's a journey. To talk about it is metaphysical. The journey seems to be actual according to these accounts, and man as the localization, the test object. Sometimes he's been called of all these principles that at the point of consciousness reflecting the universal consciousness, who is autonomous. Now again, this is a value judgment. It's not a value-free system as you have in physics, and the claim that's made in behalf of the spark that undergoes the pilgrimage is that autonomy is the law at all levels, and yet there is order within it. This is very much like Spinoza. You have both a seeming order but not a determinism, a lawfulness, all right, but not a capricious or deterministic system. And so karma is synonymous with the notion of self development, unfoldment under a rubric of autonomy, accountability to oneself, if you like, and from that one derives ethics. Now, I won't say very much more about it. I'll make two more points, and then I feel my time is up. First of all, the end point of all this cannot be stated. There really is no end point. We're talking about an infinite, open, dynamic system that is so vast that thought cannot comprehend it, even when it candidly admits that it is engaged in map making and that those maps are deficient. However, we can say certain things before thought fades out and can no longer tackle even the metaphor. The logic of all this, you might say, can be summed up as the enlightened consciousness, the Buddha figure, the involvement of oneself with the whole instead of always with the part, as is characteristic at least of the human stage, a direct awareness of the reconciliation of all the seeming opposites, so that what looks like paradox isn't from the point of view of enlightened consciousness. This is, by the way, this principle is best expressed in a book that I highly recommend to you. It's the clearest statement of this that I know. That is Lama Govinda, foundations of Tibetan mysticism. And in it he says that when consciousness is freed from its limitations, its blindness, it looks at both all and one, consciousness and matter, self and other, process and product, in a different way from the way in which we look at this now, and it no longer sees duality. It sees the all in the one, it sees the whole in the part, and therefore it is not restricted to the Cartesian three-dimensional view of either self, other, place, time, etc., etc. So it all would come together in ways that my language cannot evoke in the state of enlightened consciousness. Now, the last point that I'd like to make, because that, I think, may be a specific point of disagreement between my view and that of science in general. Notice what I've done. I haven't made it as so explicit, but I've built into this account a causal sequence that seems to turn things upside down. In asking the question about consciousness and matter, I have said in presenting this schema that consciousness comes first, and consciousness creates matter. It's the active agent. Now, science is going to say, generally says the opposite, that consciousness comes out of matter. Matter somehow gives rise to it as an emergent property or whatever, and it comes out of matter. On this account, Theosophical, esoteric, Hindu, etc., consciousness is dominant and is the active agency. We assign the active role to it. The model is more complicated. I know that. It violates Occam's razor. It's not as simple as the other model, but I feel it is the preferable model. It says that consciousness, universal consciousness, generates or makes the mechanisms, the structures that will allow individual consciousness to emerge from matter. All right, so you have consciousness precipitates itself, that's what the Upanishads say, as matter, and out of that matter there emerges, very much like the process that science describes, the slow organization of matter until it can have the kind of nervous systems and self-reflexive mechanisms out of which then individual and localized consciousness can emerge. Now, what is interesting here is that in one, consciousness comes out of matter and seems derivative with respect to matter. In the other model, the metaphysical model, consciousness, matter really is instrumental to consciousness, which uses it for its own purposes in order to evolve the forms behind it. And so the question I think that I want to leave you with is this a contradiction? Is there any way to reconcile these two views if they are as incompatible as they look on the surface? And what kinds of things can we say about them? The last thing I want to say, and I'll close with that, I'll try in our discussion, after we resume, after Fritjof's talk, to sketch the direction in which I think this could be reconciled. And I'll use both Mircea Eliade and Hegel in order to try to do this. So now I'd like to introduce my colleague again, Fritjof Capra, and he will discuss consciousness in his own way. Fritjof.
I think you will see, and those of you who were there last night will already sense there's a lot of agreement in this new view of living organisms that I've presented last night between the scientific view and the views of the perennial philosophy or mystical traditions. Although there are points of difference, and I think we'll have the heated argument that René wished. There are a few differences, and we'll need clarifications, but there are a lot more similarities than than there were even 20 years ago, I think. Because these views of living organisms that I presented last night, the systems view of living organism is something really very new and which comes much closer to the views of mystical traditions and the perennial philosophy. Now, I cannot repeat everything I said last night, but I will repeat some of the things so as to give those who were not here a chance at least to get the gist of it. First, to begin with, to talk about consciousness, I would like to clarify terms. The discussion of consciousness is always very confusing because different people mean different things when they use that word. And of course, when you introduce traditions from other cultures, it gets even more complicated because in Sanskrit, for example, they have about 15 terms, all of which are translated either as mind or as consciousness, which is not very helpful. So last night, I talked about mind, and just to briefly recapitulate, I defined mind as the dynamics of self-organization. Self-organization is a property of living organisms or living systems. Living organisms organize themselves, that is, they are relatively autonomous from the environment, and self-organization involves a number of processes that I discussed, such as self-renewal, self-healing, self-transcendence in learning or evolution, adaptation, and various other processes. These are processes of self-organization, and mind is, if you wish, the very essence of self-organization. It is the dynamics of self-organization. So mind in this view is a manifestation of matter at a certain level of complexity, and I agree very much with René that the scientific view is that matter is primary, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Matter is primary, and at a certain level of complexity, there emerge forms of matter that are self-organizing, and these are what we call living matter or living organisms or living systems. Every living organism in this view of mind has mind. Therefore, a single cell, the simplest living organism that we can imagine, has mind, and mind is also immanent in larger systems than individual organisms, such as social systems or ecosystems, the planetary ecosystem being a very large one, and finally, we talked last night about the universe as a whole, the cosmic reality as having mind, because it is self-organizing, and so we can talk about the cosmic mind. Now, the confusion, one of the big confusions about consciousness is that some people a lot of people, in fact, use the term in the sense that when I'm conscious, I can think, but if I have an accident, I'm knocked unconscious, then I'm not conscious any longer. I've lost my consciousness. Or when I sleep, I'm not conscious. So you have awareness when you're conscious, and when you're unconscious, you lose that awareness. That is not the sense in which I use consciousness. Awareness is not consciousness for me. Awareness is a property of mind. So every living being who has mind, which has mind, every animal, every plant, every single cell has also this awareness. Of course, the awareness is different in different levels of complexity. A cell will have a very rudimentary form of awareness, but awareness is a property of mind, and therefore, every cell has awareness. Now, consciousness, in the way I use it, is self-awareness, shows the property of self-awareness. The fact that we are not only aware, but we are aware that we are aware. We not only know, but we know that we know. That is what is meant by self-awareness. Self-awareness is a property of the human mind, maybe not exclusively of the human mind. There are maybe, and many people, I have had discussions with biologists who told me that higher organisms like, primates, but also, dogs and cats and mammals display various phenomena that lead biologists to believe that they also have rudimentary forms of self-awareness and therefore consciousness. But certainly these forms are not present in very low level in organisms of low complexity, like plants or single-celled organisms like bacteria, amoeba, algae, and so on. Now these would have mind and awareness, but not self-awareness. So self-awareness is something, or consciousness is something which emerges at a higher level of complexity, long after mind has emerged. So when René said before that a cell has consciousness, in my view of consciousness, it does not, and we have to clarify our terminology in the discussion then and see whether it's just a question of language or a question of disagreement. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is that last night I think I mentioned that in the dynamics of self-organization, when you talk about the processes of self-organization, fluctuations are exceedingly important. The central dynamic mechanism, if you want that word, of self-organizing systems is fluctuation. And therefore, these various traditions which have intuitively attached such importance to fluctuations, vibrations, rhythm, frequency, resonance, and so on, are now very much in harmony, or rather, one should say the other way around. Science now is very much in harmony with these traditions, because we also recognize vibrations and fluctuations as extremely important dynamic phenomena in living organisms. I should also remind you that last night we talked about larger systems than individual organisms, which are living systems, and therefore mind is immanent in them, and we can talk about a collective mind of a family, for instance, or of a group of people, of a nation, and community, and so on. And so if we see consciousness as a property of mind, then we also have to talk about a collective consciousness. And again, there's a lot of contact to be made to the ideas of Jung, for instance, the collective unconscious, because the mind has, of course, conscious and unconscious aspects in the sense now of aware and unaware. And we talk about collective consciousness also in the sense of spiritual traditions. Now, what is then this property of consciousness that emerges at a certain level of complexity? Well, I think, and this is something that I have really come to this conclusion only very recently. But I think now that science in its present form will not be able to understand the very essence of consciousness, because self-awareness is first and foremost an experience. And science, as it is done today, does not deal with experience. Science does not deal with values. And I agree very much with Dr. Weber when she introduced values as a very important aspect of consciousness. Purpose we'll have to argue about, as you predicted. Teleology we have to argue about. But values are very much, think that this is very crucial. And science, you see, today, in the form in which it is practiced, and has been practiced ever since Galileo, deals with quantities which are determined by measurement, as opposed to qualities which are determined by experience. And we can discuss that also. I think that will be a very interesting point. I believe you can have a science that deals with quality based on experience, but our present science is not of that kind. And if we really want to understand consciousness from a scientific point of view, we will have to introduce quality and experience into science. Therefore, all these physicists who go around these days talking about consciousness by adding a few more terms to their equations, I think are barking up the wrong tree. And I don't believe that this approach will at all lead to an understanding of consciousness from a scientific point of view. So we need a very different kind of science which contains values, quality, and is based on experience. Now, René has very beautifully set up that dichotomy between what you could call the scientific and the mystical view. In the scientific view, matter is primary, and consciousness emerges at a certain level of complexity. In the mystical view, it's just the other way around. Consciousness is primary, it's the ground of all being, the source, and so on, and matter emerges from consciousness, or maybe you would say descends, or becomes manifest, is precipitated, and so on. So there's a real problem here, and there seems to be a real contradiction. And about still half a year ago, if you had asked me, I would have said that this reminds me of a situation in physics in the 1920s when they had particles and waves, and the electron was a particle sometimes and a wave at another time. And then they finally were able to find a synthesis between those two views, and that it would seem that here we have a similar situation, and we have to somehow hold on to both views, and both have some value, but in the future we may find a synthesis. Now, in the meantime, studying this systems approach, I can see now actually how this synthesis will occur. And I'm going to show you the direction in which I see this synthesis going. I cannot fill in all the gaps, all the blank spots in this outline, but I do believe that the mystical view and the scientific view are consistent and can be synthesized if you adopt the systems view of living organisms.
This talk will continue on the next CD.
I don't remember whether I mentioned this last night. I may or may not have mentioned it, but it's something which is very important when you study biological structures from the systems point of view. It is a dynamic view, like also the view of modern physics, which sees process as something more fundamental than structure. Biological structures, like the structures of a cell, for instance, are a reflection of underlying process. And there are beautiful books. Well, there's one that I remember, which is especially beautiful, by Paul Weiss. It's a collection of his essays. He's a biologist, a systems biologist, and he shows beautifully with pictures and drawings and everything of plants and animals, tissues, and so on, that wherever you look in the field of life, in the field of living organisms, structures always manifest and reflect underlying process. Process is primary. Now, what kind of process is it? What kind of processes are there? Are they these processes that are underlying biological structure? Well, they are processes of self-organization, which I discussed last night. These are the key processes of biological systems. And therefore, we have to say then that biological structures are patterns of self-organization. They reflect the underlying self-organization. Now, what is self-organization? Well, the very essence of self-organization is mind. That's what I have defined as mind. Therefore, biological structures are reflections or manifestations of mind. You see, and now the two views are already approaching, because before we had the fact that matter was primary and consciousness was an emergent property. Now we have the situation that biological structures are a reflection of mind, are patterns of self-organization. Now I'm careful to say biological structures, because I'm talking about tissues, about cells, about all kinds of biological structures. And I'm not talking about rocks and stones and minerals and metals and these. These, in our current view, are not manifestations of self-organization, because we don't see how they self-organize and so on. However, I can now make an extrapolation, and this is speculation, but it seems to me a sort of natural extension, that when you go to the cosmic level and take the universe as a whole, and talk about cosmic consciousness, and see cosmic consciousness as the very essence of the cosmic self-organization. Then you can postulate that just as all the structures in a human organism are manifestations of that organism's self-organization, so all the structures in the universe would be manifestations of the self-organization of the universe. And therefore now all the rocks and minerals and atoms and particles, once you go to that cosmic level, which we haven't done yet in science, or maybe never will do, but if you go to that cosmic level, it makes sense to me to say that cosmic self-organization, which of course, as I did last night, you can identify with the divine and with the source that René mentioned in the various traditions, that cosmic consciousness is the basis or the source for all these material structures and for all the structures in the universe. And now we have really dissolved the dichotomy, because we can look at the universe now as an entire process. And maybe I should also mention something here in parenthesis, that when you look at the various terms in Eastern traditions, and not only in Eastern, also in Western mystical traditions, you will often find that their terms for the ultimate reality are dynamic terms. The Chinese call it the Tao, which is called the way the universe works. And when I talk about principles of organization, that's really just a little more scientific, but it's really the same intuition behind it. The Hindus talk about Brahman, which comes from the Sanskrit root bri, to grow, which goes back to another earlier Indo-European root that is also that was something like, I don't know, do you know how to pronounce it? It's spelled B-H-E-U, usually boo, boo. Anyway, it's that root which in Greek was the root phi or phu, which gave rise to physis, which meant the essential nature of all things. So physis and Brahman come from the same root, which means to grow. And so you see that these terms for the ultimate reality in those various ancient traditions have a very dynamic connotation. So when I say that cosmic consciousness or the ultimate reality is cosmic self-organization, that also reflects that dynamic connotation. And we have a situation then where neither matter nor consciousness are primary, but there is one complex or one phenomenon, one cosmic phenomenon, one cosmic reality, and we have two different manifestations of the same reality. And one we call matter and the other one we call consciousness. And that's pretty much, I think, what I want to end with. Thank you.
This segment of the program has now concluded. The next segment will begin momentarily.
I'd like to ask you is about this distinction between awareness and self-awareness, whether you agree that one can use consciousness in the sense of self-awareness and mind in the sense of awareness. What do you...
I would agree that there is a difference between awareness and self-awareness. Awareness would involve response to stimuli, movement towards food, avoidance of pain, etc. And I also would agree that at least part of the meaning of of consciousness is the meta-level awareness, or you said it, awareness of awareness. I'm aware that I am aware. So it's more complex, but I think there may be more to it than that.
Oh yes, there's more to it.
You're giving the cognitive.
No, there's more to consciousness than self-awareness. But it is crucial that the way I use the terms is such that awareness alone I don't call consciousness. Consciousness, if you wish, self-awareness is a necessary condition for consciousness, but not sufficient. And for the sake of the discussion, I don't know whether we can agree on that, because I feel that otherwise it gets very confusing. So even what I want to discuss is a rock conscious?
Exactly.
And or let's start with the cell first. Is a cell conscious? Then we'll go to the rock. Now, from my point of view, a cell does not have self-awareness. Therefore, it's not conscious. It does have awareness, and it has mind, but not consciousness.
But may I go to an easier example? I think the rock is one of the most difficult examples, so I want to save the rock for a moment. What would we say about your dog? Is your dog conscious?
Well, the dog, I think that's open to debate, and I don't have a dog, so...
Well, I'll supply your mind. Is my dog conscious?
When I studied these matters, I thought that consciousness with self-awareness was a uniquely human property, but then I talked to biologists who told me that no, animals show things like responsibility, pride, self-respect, and all these things in a rudimentary form. Therefore, they have rudimentary forms of self-awareness, and that's no problem for me. I don't have any problem with consciousness starting at a pre-human level. So the dog may well be conscious, have consciousness. I don't argue with that. But when it comes to plants and cells, then I would say there's no consciousness. And then we can go to the rock, which is more difficult.
I suppose this is of course very difficult, and my way out would be to explore the meanings, the wider connotations of consciousness other than awareness of awareness. I mean, that is cognitive. It restricts the focus to the entity as a knower, as an explicit knower, and from that point of view, I mean, first of all, I wouldn't, well, two things. I would not be prepared to claim that a rock in that sense is conscious, and secondly, I wouldn't know. I mean, how can I address that, or anybody? But I'll tell you what my problem with this is. I would like to leave room for the notion of consciousness that accommodates the non-cognitive. Call it the intuitive, something that bypasses brain function and mind in your sense, and doesn't need only to restrict itself to the cognitive dimension. And I give you a specific example. If it is true, as I have argued this afternoon, that the universe is an alive and conscious, I'm using that as a primitive term now, self-ordered, I totally accept your definition in the last part, self-ordered kind of total system that, of which every entity is in its own way, there's my key phrase, a reflection, then I would be prepared to hold, and it must make sense, that in its own way, a rock is tuned in to that wholeness. Now, that does not mean that, the rock is going to say, cogito ergo sum. I know that. It can say, I think, therefore I am, etc. But I would want to leave a room for a direct connection and awareness and intuitive grasp on the part of any entity in the universe, because it's made of that whole stuff. Otherwise, you've postulated two kinds of entities, and I don't want to do that.
Of course, I think everybody realizes that René has to go back to Rutgers to teach Eastern philosophy. I have to go back to Berkeley to teach physics. I'm much easier off saying, no consciousness there, since this is all on record. No, but
wait a minute, for the sake of truth, we can turn the mic off.
Off the record, the rock is conscious.
Thank you.
No, Now, let's be serious now. What you said about the rock and consciousness is very much in my line of thinking. And I would formulate it in the following way. As you've said, the universe as a whole is conscious. It's a self-organizing being. It's intimately interconnected. Everything is part of it. Nothing can be really separated. However, you can approximately separate parts, and this is why we can say you are you and I am I, and the cup is the cup and the pen is the pen, and we don't confuse them. So we can say that we can separate the rock from the rest of the universe to some extent. This is a very good approximation, and all of classical physics is based on that, and all of everyday language and experience is based on that. To that extent that we can regard the rock as an independent entity, It's an isolated, independent entity. To that extent, it does not have any mind or anything like that. It's not self-organizing. It's an inorganic, a piece of inorganic matter which does not have any of these properties. To the extent, however, that it is part of the whole, and to the extent that you can also see that in different modes of consciousness and so on, it of course will participate in the consciousness of the universe. But you see, the interesting thing about the various patterns in the universe is that some of these patterns have a consciousness even to the extent that you can separate them, like you and me and everybody else. All humans, we have consciousness. No matter in what state of mind you look at us, we separate us from the rest approximately as we do, and we still are conscious beings. Separate the rocks and they are not conscious beings. That to me is quite a clear...
Separate the rocks
from the rest of the universe. And study them with the methods of science and everything else, and you will not find any biological functioning in it. Therefore, you will not find any mind, not any awareness, or any of these things in the rock per se.
All right. Yes, I see your reasoning, and I mean it's legitimate. I would say in its own context. By the way, I think I should mention this is the second time within a year that I've had a deep metaphysical discussion with a physicist about whether or not a rock is conscious. David Bohm brought it up in London.
Seems to be a popular subject among physicists these days.
But see, we have, Fritjof, we have restricted our focus to the viewpoint of how shall we, as conscious organisms, define the other organism, whether another person or a plant or a rock.
No, and don't say a rock, because it's not another organism.
But what is it?
It's not an organism. It's a piece of inorganic matter.
Entity.
Yes.
All right, well,
yes.
All right, let's say entity as a neutral
Okay.
compromise.
Yeah.
Now, I would want to raise the following question. We've assumed that when we make these distinctions and definitions, that all of us operate always with the same level or kind of consciousness. And I feel that maybe the way to unravel what we're now saying is to bring in the question, are there different states of consciousness in us that would account for the fact, for our classification schema to begin with, so that when we're operating with, well, what the Easterners call manas, mind, which is Cartesian and categorizes and is made for, there goes teleology again, but it seems to be its special function to classify, to distinguish, to differentiate, to say this is not that and that is not that, and the rock is not a plant and not a person. Fine. From that level of consciousness, or let's say viewed from that level of consciousness, all that you and other physicists say seems to me to be correct. Now, but how shall we deal with the fact that other human beings, the mystics, have, it seems, shifted, I'll use spectrum language, Wilber's language, shifted into a state of consciousness that is not, whose feature isn't a classification or division, and in that other state of consciousness, intuitive, unitive, synthesizing, directly grasping, that rock has not been interesting for its characteristics of inertness, but has been seen as alive and part of the person. All right, now what shall we do with that?
Well,
is that legitimate?
that is fine, but because the problem then dissolves, because you don't call it a rock any longer. Words refer to separate objects, and so you wouldn't even talk about a rock. You would talk about it as the, I don't know, the rocky manifestations of Brahman or whatever. You would say, this is a pattern among the many, and you would clearly say that it is inseparably linked to all the rest, and that's fine then. Also, it's an interesting idea to not only link the rock with the rest in space, but also in time. If you look at that rock over a few billion years, then suddenly all these criteria for self-organization appear. It changes in time, it evolves, it will be formed, it will disintegrate, it will do a lot of things, but it will do so in conjunction with the rest of the planet. and be a part of the self-organization of the whole planet. It will come out of the interior of the planet, cool off, and go through this evolution. So that again shows that when you extend things in time, then things look differently. But if you, as long as you separate the rock in space and time and isolate it approximately, I would say it doesn't have any mind or anything like that.
But don't you think in that case, I mean, if you have made that concession, let's say, on the part of a scientist to the mystical view, then you're saying it depends on the context and even the time span as to what place we shall assign to any entity in the universe. If you look at it over an enormous span of time, which you'd agree is also appropriate to that entity's history, then it's one thing, and then the unity seems to predominate. And if you look at it as let's say over a shorter span and a limited context, genus, species, all that, then another picture emerges. And would you further hold that all these pictures are also true? They're not
no, none of them is true. None of them is true. No, all are valid, but none of them is true.
I see. Is there a privileged picture? Is one account
no, none of it is privileged. We are talking about different conceptual models that are valid in different situations. And as you know, ever since Heisenberg, one of the main insights in physics has been that what you see depends on how you look at it.
Right.
And so I'm very comfortable with the idea that the concept will shift if you extend the dimension in space or time or the mode of consciousness and so on.
Well, I think that's very valuable, all the more so because now we are bringing into the discussion of consciousness the notions of space and time, which we have.
Oh yeah, which is in the title, and we were supposed to do that. Yeah?
That's a happy coincidence. I think that's a happy coincidence, to relate this to what you said last night and certainly what you've argued in your book, in the Tao of Physics, would it be correct to claim that in the Cartesian and three-dimensional dualistic mode of consciousness, the schema that you've been outlining applies? In some other state of consciousness, the schema does not apply in the sense of mind and excluding lower organisms from...
First of all, I would like to say that this system's view of living organisms is anything but Cartesian.
Yes.
I mean, you shouldn't call it a Cartesian view because it really goes beyond everything that Descartes said about the world. It goes beyond the mind-matter division, and it doesn't see living organisms as machines or anything like that.
No, I was speaking what you argue against in your book. All right, the kind of restricted view of object, subject, the non-systems view fits more appropriately to this division of organisms into hierarchical structures. Okay, and so therefore, let's say on the Cartesian view, an animal is clearly not alive. I mean, it's a sort of automaton, he says. Okay, it's a machine that squeaks if you pinch it. The systems view does not hold that.
No.
And so what I'm trying to say, as you go from the Cartesian to the systems view and push that to its extreme, the point you've developed today, the whole universe is a system, the distinctions that apply get shaded. Because
that's true, because you see that there are no isolated systems, that systems interact with other systems. There are always systems within systems, and all systems are open-ended. So you really branch out.
From the point of view of any aspect, I won't call it part, of that whole system, can there be awareness of the whole system? And that gets us back. Can the rock be somehow tuned into the universe as a whole?
The rock, I would say no. Again, because
even under systems theory.
No, I thought we agreed that the rock as a part, does not have any of these properties. So, it's nothing the rock can do.
It can't be tuned in any way. There's no cognitive road for that.
No.
Okay.
And of course, higher organisms do. Can we talk about? Since we agree so much now, can we talk about teleology and get things heated up again?
Yes. Go ahead.
There might not be much of disagreement, but teleology, as you said, is a very thorny subject with scientists because of the history of science. And I was, of course, very interested in that when I studied this new theory of evolution, which is also part of that new systems view of living organisms, where evolution is an aspect of self-transcendence, which is one of the criteria for self-organization and is spontaneously present in living organisms. Living organisms will always spontaneously reach out in a creative act to create new forms and new states of being and so on. And when they do so, these systems people, Prigogine mainly, have worked out a whole theory with very simple systems, a mathematical theory of how this evolution occurs. And the theory begins with the view of a living organism as a fluctuating system. Everything fluctuates, and all these fluctuations are interrelated and interdependent. And every now and then, one of these fluctuations will be extended and fluctuate more than usual. And usually what happens is that the system conspires to bring it back, to bring the whole thing back into balance. That's the stress phenomenon and relaxation after stress. But every now and then, it will not bring the deviation back, but do the contrary, amplify the deviation, go to a state of instability, and then break through into a new state. And that's the phenomenon of evolution, of learning, of development, and so on. This is a view which is complementary to the Darwinian view of mutation and natural selection and so on. And I don't see yet how you can really combine the two, and I think nobody knows at this stage. But both are important parts of the story of evolution. Now, when this happens, so the systems theorists tell us, at the point of instability, the organism has always more than one choice, and maybe 2 or 3 or more, but there's a genuine possibility of choice, and then it will go one direction or the other or another. And if you see the whole process of evolution, maybe I can draw that since we have a board here, then it will start somewhere, reach a point of instability, and say, here are 3 possibilities. Let me just draw a few. And these are the possibilities, and the actual path, say, of the system will be this. And at every of these points, there's a decision, there's a free decision, if you wish. It cannot be predicted or calculated or anything where the system will go. And when you look at evolution as a whole, then, what they say is there is no overall purpose from the beginning. There's no long-range blueprint or plan or anything. Evolution occurs purposeful, but the purpose changes as evolution goes along. The organisms make up their purpose and change it. Just as we do when we go through everyday life, and when we walk out of the room, we have a plan. But something happens outside the door and you change your plan. Somebody comes in, you have to deviate, or you remember something, and you go along step by step and make up your mind, and there's no blueprint at the beginning. So in this view of evolution, there's order, there's a definite direction of evolution which you can discern. It's a direction towards higher order, towards more integration, towards more specificity, and you can list a number of criteria. There's a definite direction, but there's no predetermined plan, and therefore there's no teleology. I think that's what is meant by teleology.
Well, not predetermined, but plan. I think, you can have teleologies that are less determined, more determined, but there is always, let's say this, the teleological concept of the universe addresses the question, why? Now, I would like, since I'm a self-confessed teleologist, more or less, here this afternoon, I would like to ask, on that premise that you've explained, what would a systems theory view be on this question of why? Why does all this happen?
Well, this is something that does not concern me as a scientist, because science doesn't answer why questions. It's as simple as that.
Okay.
See, what we do in science is, and it's not a cheap way out, but it's important to realize that what we do in science is show how things are interrelated.
The how,
and
not the why.
Yes, and so of course I can ask, if you ask me a specific why question, if you say, why is it raining? Then I would say because there's water in the clouds. Why is there water in the clouds? Because it was hot and it evaporated from the ocean, and so on. Like children, go on and on and on. But none of these questions gives an answer. They all show how things are interrelated. And eventually all the questions are circular and come back to the beginning. And science does not go beyond these. It is maybe linked to the limitations of the rational mind. Would you say that? That's probably the limitation.
Well, I suppose
why.
the reason for it, for the shyness of science on this account, I would say is historical, and it had a good reason. And after all, science didn't acquire its power until it came out of, really got free of, the very choking teleological universe of the Middle Ages, where it had a whole, we call it the block universe, and things fell down, according to Aristotle, and then Thomism took that over because things wanted to fall down. I mean, you had an overly teleological universe, and science couldn't proceed on that narrow basis. But I think it threw out the baby with the bathwater, and maybe went to the other extreme, and frustrated, after all, what its original purpose was. You said it beautifully earlier. You went back to the Greek root. Isis means nature, and science is the inquiry into nature, and I take nature in its largest sense. So I think in its value-free, very cautious, non-teleological way, it has gained an advantage via that method, but the price has also been heavy, and it has lost the very purpose with which, let's say, at least the Greek scientists began to inquire into all of human experience, and including the place, the role of all this for the knower, the inquirer. So it's, as you well know, it's a kind of schizoid system. Here is the is, and here is the ought. Here is fact, here is value. There's no way to bring it together at the moment. But I would still, I'm willing to play the restricted game of science. And even within that, I would like to know, it has ventured some answers. It says that, from what you as its representative here have told us, it is willing to say that the evolution of organisms from minerals, plants, animals, primates, man, seems to be in the direction of developing a more complexity, reflexivity, and all that. So it's, in a way, giving it, I don't know if it's purely descriptive or if it's applauding that at the same time. Is it saying this is there's a greater value to have self-ordered complex systems to...
No, it wouldn't say that.
It wouldn't say that.
No.
Can they do things that...
It's obviously something very beautiful.
Right.
But that statement would not be...
No.
part of the theory, would be part of the research, because it would motivate you to do research. But
so the fact, you see, as I look at this as a cosmology which tries to account for our experience with the universe, and you used that very good word before, experience, the qualitative, not just the quantitative, the measurement. I find, since science apparently cannot do it, and you've said it probably cannot do it.
But I want to distinguish between putting in values, I think that we can, and answering why questions.
All right.
I think I want to distinguish between those. First yes, the second no.
Would the question as to, well, let me not use purpose, I'll use a much more modest word, the meaning of evolution, be appropriate to science?
I don't think so, no.
It wouldn't?
No. No, I don't think so. It's a more modest word, but it's really very similar. It's very close to purpose. And also, I think that let's try and answer it, right? So you try and answer the meaning. So you go to a large dimension, and you take a cosmic dimension, and you say you have to extend your notions of space and time, and you go beyond ordinary notions of space and time, and then I always feel, and I haven't really tried to express this verbally, but I have this strong intuitive feeling that at some point this question of why becomes meaningless. That when you are beyond a direction of time, see, somehow it's related to cause and effect,
Exactly.
that why question.
That's right.
So when you go beyond linearly flowing time, and you talk about the universe, there's nothing but the universe is everything there is, and then you ask for a purpose, doesn't really make sense.
Well, no, not if you frame it that way. If you, I mean, that, you see, that would go back to the level at which I began this afternoon. The source is,
that's right.
and there's nothing more to be said.
Right.
But that isn't the burning question for human beings. The burning question for human beings is, how am I related to the source? What can the meaning be of the fact that the source didn't remain at its own origin, that it gave itself out, that it othered it, I use Hegel's word, it othered itself, it made itself into a world, I am a part of that world, and I think, given the kind of minds we have, you virtually have to repress that kind of question by either conditioning, as scientists have, or by an act of will. It is a natural question to say, I'll use Heidegger's phrase, why is there anything rather than nothing? Why are there finite creatures? What is the sense of the localization when you have the overall principle? And I think this is where that question comes in.
No, and I think the crucial point, I think, is, at least for me, it seemed to me while you were talking, was when you were mentioning the source of all this, the cosmic source, and how am I related to the source?
Exactly.
Now the answer to the why question would be in answering that question. How am I related to the cosmic consciousness?
Precisely.
And this is something which you cannot answer. Now I know why science can't answer these why questions. This is something you cannot answer scientifically. It's an experience which goes way beyond the scientific framework, but you can experience it. So the why question is important and can be answered, but it cannot be answered scientifically or rationally even.
That was my next question.
But you can experience it.
Yes,
so
you can experience it, and when you shift from that experience to another state, the kind of shared three-dimensional Cartesian experience, can something be said about that? This is where I think we differ. I feel it can.
Yeah, now you see, I can relate this to what I wanted to say anyway about values in science. You see, that if you include experience and values in science, then in such a science you would be more likely to be able to say something about the why questions. But we don't have it yet, so it's difficult to guess, what we'll be able to do with such a science. But let me tell you how I see this science as, being structured. What you do in science is you observe phenomena, right? It's based on observation, and then you construct a theoretical framework, a logically coherent, consistent theoretical framework that interconnects the observed data and tries to make sense of them, explains them or interconnects them. And the interconnections are consistent, logical, and so on. You may or may not use mathematics depending on the science, but that's basically what you do when you do science. Now, the observations refer to quantities which are obtained by measurement. In a science based on experience, the data would be qualities obtained through experience, and you would not try to explain the qualities. See, the qualities would be given. Those would be the data. So you would talk about sadness and joy and elation and about colors, for instance. Science does not know anything about colors. Science can never explain or understand red.
They can just find the spectral analysis.
Yeah, they can give you the wavelength of the light, but the red is an experience. And so this type of science would have the elements would be experiences, and it would not be objective, but then we know that nothing is objective anyway in science, so we are easier about that now. And so the agreement would be based on experience, on the mutual agreement between people, much like artists, for instance, do it. Artists, when they talk about paintings, at least if they belong to a cultural group and so on, they pretty much agree on what they see based on common experience. And that would be, or maybe we can talk about Eastern traditions and talk about, well, I don't know, any tradition like Buddhism or anything like yoga, which is based on experience, and they have a very consistent framework, but the framework interrelates experiences. That would be a science in that sense. Now, something which is also important in my view of science is that science is always approximate. So to the extent, if for instance some Eastern tradition tells you there are 5 levels of consciousness, and if they say that's how it is and you better believe it, then that's not a science. If they say that our experience can be represented best and most conveniently in terms of 5 levels of consciousness, that's a scientific statement.
Yes. And I think...
And some of them do that, some of them don't. They are, as you know, they are of both kinds.
They are probably all of them, all the ones I'm familiar with, have what I would call this experiential dimension, and when you talk about the possibility of sharing experience in order to get to, you're really trying to forge a bridge between inner states and perceptual states of objects or whatever. I would think we really have the rudiments of such a bridge, but it's been confined mostly to the East. Meditation is to that kind of, is to the qualitative experience what mathematics is to the quantitative, I would say, and Western scientific language. And I think in the last few years, people working along these lines, I have myself used it, have very liberally resorted to the term inner empiricism to describe the peculiarities of that method. It is experiential. Some of it, true, is ineffable. You can't translate it into words. Meditation is its most appropriate, it seems, vehicle, methodology, just as in physics, mathematics is. So I think some of that is already there. And what I would like really to bring into this is the notion of space and time. See, I think just as in your book you have very eloquently put forth the case that space and time change as the state of the observer is changed. I think the Eastern systems have been saying that space and time surely change in the meditative state, and it is as legitimate a state, it's probably a deeper state into the ground of things, and it cannot be experienced unless the shift has taken place.
Yes.
Would you agree to that?
Yeah, that's what I said in the Tao of Physics.
Exactly.
I thought you were quoting me.
Yes, I'm also quoting you. So I mean, therefore it would seem that these complementary, as you say, the systems are with us, and the notion, I mean, let's even relate it to the notion of the why question or the purposiveness. I think in that state of consciousness that enlightened figures describe or talk about, everything is clarified to them, they say. The why or the wherefore is clarified, but not in ordinary terms in the examples that we've given. The question disappears, as you say.
Yes, I would like to emphasize a point that I have recently learned. I should say that this whole view of quantity and quality and experience, the science of experience, I was very much stimulated by Adi Lang this last summer. Lang is the Scottish psychiatrist who has written a lot about schizophrenia and a lot about other things. And he has written a book which is not yet published but will come out soon, and which is called The Testimony of Experience. And he attempts to provide this sort of groundwork for such a science based on experience. As a psychiatrist dealing with schizophrenics and other severe psychotic states and having experiences in mysticism, LSD, and all kinds of all the states of consciousness, he has great experience with these extreme states of consciousness from a scientific point of view. And so I think it's going to be a very interesting book. And what he pointed out to me very forcefully was that it is not only those mystical states which make us realize how we are related to the source of consciousness and so on. A shadow of this realization is in every experience of consciousness. As we are sitting here, I experience you, I experience our discussion, our arguments, our opposition, our harmony and integration and all that. I experience the whole audience there, and every one of us experiences everyone else, and according to our different sensitivities, these experiences are stronger or weaker, but all this is really a shadow of the mystical experience. So we're talking about degrees, and we're not talking about black and white, and either you have it or you don't. A glimpse of the answer to these why questions comes in every conscious experience, I think.
Yes. So therefore, one would say that sensitivity to any ordinary experience gives an aspect of the insight into the whole.
It gives you a head start, maybe.
A head start, yes. All right. Fritjof, I think the other thing I wanted to raise is this question of space and time in different states of consciousness. It occurred to me as I was thinking about our seminar that some of the ways in which you describe, physics describes and you describe beautifully in the book, space and time and space-time, they seem to common sense so fantastic that we have no model for it, we have no way to conceptualize it, to imagine it. And then it occurred to me that the closest that we come, and this is a two-way street, to somehow understanding what space and time as described by modern physics might be all about is to reflect on what the Buddha figures say about their own experience with respect to space and time. I mean, the interpenetration of everything, the simultaneity of everything. For the Buddha, all ages, all epochs, all lives he had lived through were simultaneous. Now, I think before the advent of 20th century physics, that sounded like something fantastic and unimaginable under any circumstances. So I am wondering, do you feel that through modern science one can conceptualize that better, and also through role models of Eastern or Western mystics one can also imaginatively clothe the terminology of science better?
Well, I certainly feel that for myself, and that's why I've called my book The Tao of Physics, which is the way of physics, and Tao in the sense is a spiritual path, also in the Chinese sense. And I think that physics can be such a path, or part of such a path. But that, of course, would depend on the individual. For many people, physics would bring added confusion, and they would be much happier with just meditation and experience altered states of consciousness in space and time through meditation, instead of using the rational mind to study physics to get a glimpse of it. But if you are already rational and you are already a scientist and you have done all that, then I think it helps very much.
And also, isn't it, as you said in your book, and I think you said it yesterday, that any particle in the universe, it has a long history. It's been involved with particles in quotes, energy patterns, with everything else in the universe. So the time span, I think, for us is so fantastic. It's so fantastically large, and it's also so minuscule when you come to clocking processes in the laboratory. That evoked in me the association with what Theosophy, Platonism, Eastern philosophy says about not the lifeline now of a particle, but the lifeline of this complex of consciousness in us, that we do not begin or end as objective science at the moment says we do, 70 years ago, that the canvas is so enormous for lives as it is for particles. Now, is that, do you think, a legitimate comparison?
Yes, and I think that will come out much stronger as this systems biology is going to be developed. You see, my greatest encouragement in the last couple of years in comparing science with mysticism has come from the study of biology and psychology. And when I wrote my book in 74, I ended it in 74, I had not much of an idea about the other sciences and how would they react and what's going on there. But now I feel that you can look at physics, but you can also look at the systems biology, and you can also look about psychology, the way Ken Wilber looks at it. And those three sciences would all agree and paint a picture for which that of the perennial philosophy is the most adequate and consistent. I'm just tremendously thrilled by that convergence of Western science.
They come together, you feel, in a legitimate way in this
yes,
century.
Definitely.
Which is really a very puzzling thing. I mean, why? Again, I'm sorry, it's a chronic pattern. Why? Why do you suppose that it took 20-some centuries before this could happen?
Oh, I think that is because science is getting deeper now. First we scratched the surface of reality, and now we're getting a little deeper, and we have depth psychology and depth this and depth that. So I think we're getting a little deeper into the essence of things. Maybe we could take...
Yes, I think, exactly. I think the time would be good now. Why don't we invite verbal participation on part of the audience? I think this gentleman was first. Yes.
I would, as a fellow physicist and philosopher, I would like to challenge you first on the mineral basis. You know, as I do, that atoms have a choice. I'm specifically thinking in two-way radioactive decay. And the whole phenomenon on radioactivity came for me only be understood that atoms have a communication. So you go first, I wait 5,000 years. This would be the basic question on the mineral side. And then on the cell side, a sperm who enters a vagina he never has been, knows his way, goes upstream, fights like hell, and meets what he supposedly isn't.
Alright, in that case, I guess.
It's a system of a kind of self-consciousness.
Is this for Fritjof, I hope? So is that question for Fritjof, I hope?
Yes, okay. Now, I think the one thing that the systems approach has shown is that indeterminacy is a much more frequent phenomenon in the universe than we thought. See, in the old days with Descartes and Newton, scientists thought everything was determined and the universe was running like a clockwork. And then Heisenberg came along and showed that at the atomic level, this is not so. Then a lot of philosophers came and said, well, maybe this is where free will comes in. And then most of the physicists, including myself, always said, nonsense, that's not where free will comes in. And now with the systems view, we see that this indeterminacy exists at every one of these points in the evolution of a system, just as an example. And so indeterminacy is much larger. Now, to answer your question, how the Heisenberg indeterminacy of a radioactive decay is related to this system's indeterminacy, I don't know. And when I wrote the chapter in my new book about this, I have a footnote in there which says precisely that I'm aware that there are these two indeterminacies and it remains to be explored how they are related, if and how. So I don't have an answer, but
All right.
that remains to be seen.
You had a question, yes.
An observation. The purpose, an objective in the universe indicates the creator, a force behind, intelligence behind, a God. Isn't that so? If you say there is a purpose, there is the plan. The plan requires a planet.
Not necessarily. No. I mean,
Be a plan without a plan.
well, I didn't call it a plan. Try to avoid that. But it's a very important question. Let's explore that. You say that the notion of purpose, or I like a wider word, purposiveness. A direction, a purposiveness, and non-neutrality, okay? A development. And you say that implies a planner. Yes. I would want to argue that I hold on to purposiveness, but I don't speak of someone who plans the purpose. Now, I grant you that is not answering the question fully, but to me there is a mystery in this. I would not want to call the universe as a whole God. I mean, I have no objection to the word, but it has so many other connotations, all right? So let's say cosmic consciousness seems to me, when I look at its, what it's doing, at its doings, everything we've described this afternoon, it all tends towards, okay, so that's where the idea of purposiveness comes in. Self-reflexivity, self-awareness, self-consciousness, reunification in some way with itself, and that's as much as I would be willing, I think, to assert. I wouldn't want to say it. I'll tell you why I would oppose it. I guess on Spinozistic grounds. Your model of a planner and a plan is too dualistic. It locates the source.
No, I was just asking.
Yeah. Okay.
I just asking. So you,
Yeah.
for a purpose, because they
No.
the purpose, there is an entity that has.
No, I would say the universe as a whole has that purpose. It's immanent. It's not transcendent to the universe. In a nutshell, that's how I would want to say it. Do you follow me? The whole thing, in all its manifestation, tends towards that. But there's no one outside, like a stage director, saying to matter, now you do this and get yourself evolved and come back to me. That's the model I want to avoid.
Can I make a comment?
Oh, yes. In this other model, Dr. Capra, an act of creation is there in every branch. Therefore, in the universe itself is built somehow the act of creation.
I would just second the question and say, if you talk about the plan, then you seem to introduce this dualism. If the universe is moving towards something, then there's the universe and the thing that it moves towards. And whereas I don't believe there's a plan, I believe the universe makes up the plan as it goes along, and therefore it's immanent in the process of evolution. There's no predetermined or prefabricated
I
plan.
understand. Can I just quickly get to that, and then I hope I'll have a lot of further questions on this. I think, both of you have stuck me with a position I don't really hold. I didn't say plan, I said purposiveness, and the universe isn't moving towards something other than itself. Now, I think the one step on which we disagree, and that's probably what introduces the problem, is given that the universe does anything with itself other than being the source, given it once manifests, I feel, it distances itself from itself and then comes, in order to, I'm willing to be teleological, in order to come home to itself. But all that is located within the system. There is no agency outside of it. There is no planner and planned, but it's a matter of actualization and potentiality. That's how I would introduce the dichotomy.
It just sounds to me like a long and complicated story, instead of saying that, we make up the purpose as we go along.
I don't understand what this means. We make it up as we go. Who makes it up?
Well, all of us. We as cosmic intelligence, I'm talking for the universe now.
We haven't finished it, but there are lots more questions. I think, yes, and then we'll go 1, 2, 3. Okay.
You both reject the concept of dualism as unacceptable, but neither one of you said why. Why do you both reject dualism as opposed to the opposite?
Well, I think because this is what brought us inflation and the neutron bomb and all the problems we have now. And I'm serious about that. That's the theme of my new book, that Cartesian dualism is useful to a point, but it has now outlived its usefulness. And although we can use it in an approximate way, in a certain sense, when we do classical physics and things like that, to hold it as an absolute position is not very useful any longer.
And to that, I would just add that I think, especially in Descartes, who was, a magnificent dualist. As long as you're going to be one, you might as well be a magnificent, thoroughgoing one. I think in Descartes we discovered that if you divide matter and consciousness to the degree that he did, consistently, and make them substances different in kind, you can't get them back together. There's no way then to account for mind-body interaction. And so on those grounds, and also that it seems to license us in good conscience to exploit nature and exploit others. So on ethical grounds, as well as other grounds, I think it's not a good model. Now, yes, he was next.
I'd like to just present a process and ask some questions in terms of helping me to get clear about defining terms. If the stomach is distended with meat, a hormone is released called gastrin, circulates in the blood, goes back to the stomach, causes the parietal cells to secrete acid. The increasing acidity in the stomach shuts off the release of gastrin. Okay. Is this self-organizing activity? Is it mind? Is it self-awareness? Is it awareness in some other sense? Or do these issues not relate to that process at all? In other words, I'm trying to bring this down to absolutely physical, but biological area.
As far as I can follow you, the answer is yes, yes, no, yes, no. Okay. Now let me remember what the questions were. I just counted as you said. You see, that's why I'm so excited about this new model, that I can really give clear-cut answers. The whole model may be wrong, but it really is a, it really allows one, and that's, that's the scientific method. You put out the model and you test it. Okay, the first question was, is it self-organization? Yes.
Is this self-organization?
Yes. It's part of mind, yes. It's not self-awareness. And what was the last one? Or is this not relevant? Well, yes, it is relevant.
It would appear to me that process.
This is the mechanistic aspect of the process of self-organization.
This is.
You have given me the mechanism.
This is a biological process, and it would appear to me that there's a tremendous amount of self-awareness in this process. There's an awareness that food is entering the stomach.
Yeah, but that's not self-awareness. That's awareness of the food. That's not awareness of being aware. So the stomach doesn't say, I'm aware that food is coming in, and I'm also aware, as René said, cogito ergo sum. The stomach doesn't say that.
You see, if you were to then go ahead and describe a biological organism, perhaps you might have a list of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of such processes. As a matter of fact, a biological organism would consist of these processes. Now, and after the list of these processes gets very, very large, you have a tremendous amount of, I don't know what word to use other than awareness of self, awareness of what's going on. It's a tremendous capability. In any case, I don't understand where, if the self-awareness does not come out of that, I don't know, in other words, some large number of processes, could it, I don't understand where the self-awareness comes from.
Yeah, I don't either, and I think from the scientific point of view, you see, it comes out somewhere, not at the level of the stomach, we believe, but it comes out at some higher level, and unless we can include experience and have that new type of science, I don't think we'll ever understand it.
You see, with my argument that since we know that all of these processes exist, why would we not simply conclude that consciousness is in fact that? You feel that you want to define consciousness as self-awareness, and somehow it's somehow not. You found, in other words, mechanistic. These processes are mechanistic.
Yes.
You call them that.
Yes.
I think that they all fit together beautifully.
Yes.
So that consciousness, in other words, it would simply appear that consciousness is in fact a product.
Now you want to restrict, in other words, you want to say, why is another term needed other than the behavioristic formulation? And I think both Fritjof and I feel it is truly needed to describe what happens. We are aware of ourselves as being aware, and you can take that to a number of further levels, meta level.
Yeah.
I see myself thinking of thinking, etc. You can go multidimensionally, and I don't think behaviorists can handle that as well. But anyhow, I think we're going to just come back to you in a while. Yes?
Well,
My question was related to the gentleman's question over there, and that is, I understood, or at least I've read some of the Eastern philosopher that said that if we give it a purpose, life a purpose, or whatever it is, we set a goal. And so when we set a goal, we also set a time limit. And since it's infinite, eternal, and everything else, how can there be a purpose and a goal then? So then what you're doing is, in other words, each day or each minute or that is just to be, and to be aware that you are, and that's as much as you go. You don't go on beyond that.
I see. All right, so...
Good point.
It's
you were talking about purpose. All the questions that contain the word purpose are addressed to you.
All right. Well, does somebody want to bail me out? I can come back to it. Yes. Do you want to address that question? Because we don't want to take a new question, right? No. All right. Now, so the question on the floor is, well, there's really several parts to your question. I would say that someone who speaks of purposiveness to the universe, namely that it distances itself, goes through experience, and more fully comes back to itself, that does not imply a time limit, because now I was being conservative today, believe it or not. If I had been less conservative, I could have brought in other factors, other features that show the amplitude of this whole notion, including, let's say, if the purpose, quote unquote, purposiveness of making every blade of grass into a Buddha figure, right, as in Mahayana Buddhism is the assertion, when that has been fulfilled, which is never, because there's always more coming into the pipeline, if you will, there is ample reason to feel that Buddha figurehood isn't the last stage of the development of consciousness. The unfoldment, the potential is almost limitless. I mean, it is as much as language can refer to or can contain. And if one were not being conservative about this whole system, and I'm quite comfortable with that, in fact, one could say that the forces of nature, what we call the laws of nature, are themselves, perhaps, made up of highly developed, highly intelligent consciousnesses, way beyond the human level. In Buddhism, there's a nice term for this. They are the Jnani Buddhas. They become part of the operating forces of nature. They no longer have individuality of our sort. And that development is endless. I think imagination can barely contain it, and it sounds like science fiction. To me, it's entirely logical. So, purposiveness, I don't think I like the idea of plan. Now, you ask a very good question. How do you reconcile that which seems goal-oriented with the admonition in the Eastern systems to live in the moment, right? The eternity in a moment, and all reality is in one flower. And I think they are reconcilable, although one can lose sight of, especially in success-oriented American cultures, we feel I must drop everything in the moment and quickly get to, etc., unfoldment. That would thwart the purpose. I think the rationale of looking at the universe in this way is to keep in mind both these dimensions, that the moment is all eternity and is self-sufficient, and at the same time the moment points beyond itself to other moments in time. Now that's the best I can say it. I think, again, the person who explores this question most clearly and beautifully is Lama Govinda, who says the reconciliation of the universal with the particular seems to be what the whole cosmos is tending towards and what it's all about. It's a very good question. Are there other... Yes?
You talk about the mind as the dynamics of self-organization. It seems that the mind becomes a very materialistic thing, a very Euclidean thing. How do you rationalize or explain, say, things, emotions, and from that, let's say, curiosity, thoughts, and maybe intuition?
Well, I don't believe that this view of mind as an expression of self-organization is a materialistic, maybe in the true sense of the word, that you sort of recognize all the glory there is in matter. I don't see this as pejorative. Although people always say that, often say that America is a very materialistic culture, that's not really true, because the food would be much better if it were. So it's really an idealistic culture. What people do is they worry about the stock market, which is just about the most abstract thing you can think of. So I'm not against materialism in that sense. I don't think that matter is the basis of all, but I don't think it's belittling it and losing one's awe of the universe by seeing mind as an expression of matter, an expression of self-organization. And there is a way to include emotions and intention and all that, but it really, first it would take me too long, and secondly I don't know it well enough, but you should read that book by Jansch, which is called The Self-Organizing Universe, that I've mentioned last night. And he goes into all of this.
What about growth, though? Intellectual and spiritual growth?
Yes, that's part of the self-transcendence. Growth and development, spiritual development is a key example of self-transcendence.
It's not part of the mind.
That is, yes, that is part of the mind, and that's a very essential aspect of it.
Fritjof, it's interesting. I'll just comment before we go into the next question. The interchange that just took place is really reminiscent of everything Spinoza says, and I commend to people who are interested in these questions Spinoza's famous work called Ethics, and in it he says, very much along the lines that you've suggested, that there are two ways one can interpret this manner of proceeding. One can say, in doing this, we are pulling spirit down and making it secular. But Spinoza rejects that interpretation and says, on the contrary, we are divinizing matter. Matter is in itself, there's nothing wrong with matter. It's not a stepchild of the universe. It's the body of the universe. And consciousness or thought is its mind. And the two both are, if you want to give it a value judgment, sacred. And they must go hand in hand together. And I think we don't often think of that.
I just hope that nobody noticed that you slipped in the word spirit, because that would keep us here another 5 hours.
Well, Fritjof, I don't think they did, but they did now. Now they noticed.
That's something I still have to do as a homework, because in my new book I use the word spiritual a lot, but I never talk about spirit, and then I have to clarify with myself.
Yes.
If one were to ask the question whether the Eastern mysticism deals with the evolution of the part or of the whole, would it be correct to say that really it addresses both?
That's a fascinating question. Did everyone hear that question? The question was, if one were to ask whether Eastern mysticism deals with the evolution of the part or of the whole, ought one to say that it deals with both? Isn't that what you say? Now, I think this is a very fascinating question, and what it brings in, and it's not an easy question, it brings in the notion, from my point of view, of time, temporal and non-temporal dimensions of reality. The traditional view, almost the cliche view, is that, the source, the atemporal reality, that shoots forth these rays of itself, manifest, and then they go through the eons of development and evolution and come back to it, changed, leave it itself unchanged. That's the cliche view. And I think the deeper view is that cannot be. Then the universe is illogical, and I stubbornly maintain that it is a logical universe. And so I would postulate that both the part, call it the aspect, and the whole are somehow transformed or unfolded, therefore changed in this process. So I'll paraphrase Bohm, who also, we talked about this together. The universe looked at in its eternal aspect has something to gain from going through time and space and development and history and all that, just as much as the entities that go through that have something to gain from it and bring back themselves in a different form. Can I add something to that? I've been wanting to introduce it. I won't be long with it. One other way one could look at all this, it's related to your question, and would probably bypass the notion of purposiveness, and I'd love to get off the hook with that. I see it's such a difficult concept to validate or to prove. To use Eliades' notions, and he does this with respect to the Sankhya system. He says, it's almost a time reversal, as physics would use it. He says, in a way, the effect, and call the world and ourselves the effect of the cause, the effect already exists. It exists before the whole thing begins, and that all that can be brought about by the cause is the manifestation of the effect, or the development of the effect, of the pre-existing effect. And so what one would be doing there is to make an analogy between the statue that's already exists but is locked into the block of marble, and time and history and ordinary space and development just is the process of chipping away at the block of marble and freeing what's in there. I don't think that entails a plan. It just...
No, that's the same as the diagram up there.
How wonderful.
Look, the blue stuff is all the marble and the red line is the statue.
Exactly. So there then we're not talking so much about plan and time, but the
potential and potentiality and
exactly, the Aristotelian potentiality and actuality, and the effect is already potentially there in the cause, and it needs space, time, and history to spell itself out and actualize itself.
What philosophical school holds it?
It's called the Weberian school after René Weber.
No, I think
credit where credit is due.
I would gladly take credit if it were due, but it has more honorable precedent. I think the whole Sankhya Yoga would hold to that. Theosophy certainly does, in a way the Platonic systems do. As far as potential and actual, I mean, those terms are Aristotelian. Aristotle says that motion just makes explicit through an efficient causation what's already implicit in it. And I think that notion of explicit, implicit, unfolded, enfolded, all work very well to describe this. Yes?
You were saying before your presentation that there's a causal sequence which kind of turns scientific thought upside down. And that was that consciousness is the primary constituent of reality.
Yes.
Okay, now I was wondering if, even though it may not be perceived, could there be matter without consciousness?
Could there be matter without consciousness? Don't you think?
There's no consciousness.
Let's take a poll.
Pardon me?
Let's take a poll.
Well, if what I've said is correct, it can't, because matter is the precipitated mirror image, a dense, overt mirror image of consciousness. It's what consciousness makes as its byproduct when it wants to show itself explicitly. So if I've said it correctly, then the answer to that would be no.
But keeping with your logical universe, could there be matter?
Could there be matter without consciousness?
Yeah.
No, not in the universe I've sketched and endorsed today. No, I should think not. Yes?
As a follow-up to his question, a rock.
Back to the rock.
Expression of consciousness?
Can you say that again? I didn't hear it all.
Is the rock an expression of this
Yes.
consciousness?
Yes.
Is it an entity?
Yes.
If I take a sledgehammer to it, do I suddenly get a tribe or a family? Or is it just the same consciousness expressing it in 25 different ways?
I would think 25, billion, etc.
And each one becomes an entity, self-conscious?
I would say...
No, it doesn't become self-conscious, ever.
Not according to Fritjof, anyhow, right? It does not become... It has mind, but not self-conscious.
No, it doesn't have mind, my God. After sitting here for 3 hours.
No,
no mind. Rocks have no mind. Not even pet rocks. No mind.
But just to satisfy...
It's a reflection of cosmic consciousness, a manifestation of cosmic consciousness, and whether or not you split it into pieces doesn't matter, because at that level you don't talk about pieces. So, you can do all your splitting, it still remains one. That is a level where you'll go beyond sledgehammers and
all right.
splitting
Yes,
into
I think
pieces.
The question I had when you were discussing earlier, and we came back to it, so this is a good demo, I guess, is referring to the various levels of consciousness. How conscious is man? And within mankind, what variations do we find of consciousness?
I would say man is a little less conscious than woman to begin with. And within mankind, there are lots of variations.
What was the
No, I'm to get specific.
I don't use man, the generic man, any longer because it's a patriarchal term which I think has done a lot of harm, and so I would talk about human beings or men and women, and that's, I suppose, what you meant. And of course there are great variations in levels of consciousness, as all the mystics always tell us, and it goes from, Renee knows much better than I what kind of systems they have to describe these levels of consciousness and variations, and it depends on one's state of self-realization, and what is true for an individual is also true for a society, and there are more or less evolved societies and cultures and so on. What do you think?
Yes, and I suppose, the intent behind your question is, where are we now in our state of evolution? Isn't that what you're saying?
What is potentially
Yes.
beyond it?
Well,
or what
yeah.
is beyond it right now?
Well, what is the... I mean, I think a lot of us would argue that, I think Fritjof said it very eloquently last night, we're in an imperiled state. We are not using anything near the potential of our consciousness, of our self-consciousness, and maybe we should make this connection a little bit to the society. If everything that I think Fritjof in his own way has said, and certainly everything mystics through the ages have said, is the more self-conscious an individual, a human being becomes, the more he knows himself interconnected to the whole. That is to say, to other human beings, to other forms of life, to the planet as a whole, and the more clearly he is aware of that, the more he translates that awareness into his daily conduct, and certain ethical tones would follow that, alas, are at present missing. Therefore, by that single criterion, since we are so fragmented and our value system betokens fragmentation, not the awareness of the one life, I think we have a very long way to go, and we ought to do it in a hurry, because, as Fritjof said, of the weapons that our minds have known how to develop, and our consciousness hasn't understood.
I just want to add that although it's rather touchy to mention the election, and we could get into long political discussion, which we don't want to do and don't have time to do, I nevertheless, for the record, want to say that the next administration that has been voted in, plus their supporters, the moral majority, the corporations, and so on, are light years away from everything we are talking here, and are part of the old paradigm, and increase the danger through nuclear weapons, anti-ecological behavior, and all of that. So there's a direct reflection in politics of states of consciousness.
I think you didn't have a chance, and then you. Okay.
I can agree with what you're saying about the old paradigm and the problems it's caused. You've both spoken of ethics and values, and yet you seem to describe a fairly value-neutral process in which one red line down a branching path is equally as good as any other, or in this going out and homecoming, one manifestation is equally as good as any other manifestation.
No, you see, this is a dynamics which is valid for all levels of mind, for all self-organizing systems. And when you talk about very simple levels, values don't come into the picture. But when you talk about self-awareness, consciousness, then the values come in. So all this also holds for consciousness. It's not the whole story. There's much more to it.
I would like to add a comment to that, because I I agree, basically, I would say, very much with the intent, I think, behind your question. And so I would like to Now add one characterization of my schema, my cosmology, that I haven't talked about this afternoon. I'm willing to characterize this self-ordered, self-aware system, the whole conscious universe, as not just orderly, but as compassionate. That value. Therefore, I'm saying the universe, when truly understood, is not value-free, and the closest approximation, just in human terms, that I would want to give this is the word compassion, coming from Buddhism, or the word love. And though that is not manifest in all entities as it should be, nor in all human beings, I believe if we understood the nature of the ground that supports us and of which we are part, we would reflect that value of love and compassion in our daily lives, as enlightened beings, Buddha figures, bodhisattvas, and so on do in fact do. So I'm very comfortable with attributing the overriding character of the universe as compassion.
You can get around, say, Ivan Karamazov's problem.
Yes, absolutely. I teach that. I like that. I like Dostoevsky. He's talking about Dostoevsky's brothers Karamazov, where Ivan Karamazov, who plays the role of the arch-rationalist, the hyper-scientist, and isn't willing to allow that a universe in which there can be human suffering, he says, of innocence, right? Of innocent children and so on, that such a universe is compatible with the notion of a divine intelligence. I think I could get around that, but that would be a whole other, seminar. I think the fault of human suffering is the insensitivity and the ignorance of human beings, not of the ground as a whole.
If we're kind of evolving our own purpose as we go, which is what you seem to have said before, then is that what she just said a message that the last 10,000 years of human history is? Have we made that up over the last 10,000 years?
What? That her message would be implicit in the last 10,000?
If the universal consciousness is making a purpose as it evolves, as it goes along. I'm trying to say what you said a while ago.
Yes?
Okay, have we discovered that we've made up anything in the last 10,000 years?
Oh, sure we have.
Is that one thing?
Well, we have done a lot of things in the last 10,000 years, good and bad, so...
Many messages,
Many messages.
In other words, not just
there's
one.
not a single one.
We'll take one last question and then we'll close. Yes, he had his hand.
My question is, I'm emotionally upset at this point. I've listened to this all day, and the question I
You should have said it earlier.
That's right. We could have helped you then.
It's taken 15 forms, and I'm not sure what form it has now. We've pushed human imagination to the limit here all day long. We visualize this grand schemes, and then we visualize the particles which are actually interrelationships, so on and so forth. We're saying this is who I am. Saying I'm a system, I make decisions at points, saying all these things about me, and I'm trying to figure out how this bears on my everyday life, for one thing. We talk about human suffering. What's the point? Why does a nuclear war, for example, disturb us if we're all one with everything and there's a transcendent nature and we're all made out of particles anyway? What's the difference if we just rearrange these particles around in a nuclear holocaust? What's the point of it all? Where's the point, is what I'm saying?
No, I have come across this question very often and struggled it very often. And I think it's also in most of the mystical traditions I'm aware of, they take a position one or the other. And I think you can say that from the cosmic point of view it doesn't matter. But to me that's not good enough. And somehow it seems that the human condition is such that you have to live with both of these worlds. It's somehow necessary, or you have a fuller realization if you acquire a cosmic point of view or part of it. But at the same time you have to act right here on the Earth, on the planet. And I'm very interested in the survival of the planet, and I'm politically active, and I'm, in the anti-nuclear movement and all of that, and I'm very interested in that. Some traditions, some mystical traditions are, some are not. To me, that was always one of the difference between the Chinese and the Indians, and that's why I prefer the Chinese to the Indians. That the Chinese traditions like Taoism are very ecologically minded and very much interested in peace and survival, harmonious interplay of all the forces, where the Indians would often say, well, it doesn't really matter, you know, from the cosmic point of view. And maybe that's why people in India are hungry and in China they are not. Maybe that's one of the differences. I don't know, but I think, personally, I feel that you have to be on both levels. And it's not easy, but I think...
Well, I think on that note, we're going to close the seminar.